Breathe slowly now, and let your eyes grow heavy. The world outside can wait, while here you can rest, safe and quiet. Tonight's bedtime story drifts far south into the silent white expanse of Antarctica, a place of endless ice, where time feels paused, where whispers of ancient mysteries lie hidden beneath the frozen ground. Some say secrets sleep there, secrets even experts turn away from. As you sink into stillness, imagine the hush of winds across the glaciers, the soft crack of distant ice, the calm weight of history pressing gently beneath your thoughts. There is no need to solve or prove, only to listen and to dream. This guided sleep journey will let your mind wander like snow carried on the breeze, gentle, unhurried, at ease. So settle back, breathe once more, and let the ancient silence of Antarctica carry you into deep sleep. White silence, black memory, they call it a desert of ice. But deserts do not hum. They do not pull at the edges of memory like a whisper beneath the skull. Antarctica is not silence. It is the sound of something buried too deep to scream. Here. Wind is the only voice, and yet it echoes. This is not a story about ice. It is a memory breaking through the frost. Long before the maps were drawn, before the names were assigned, there were stories of a land in the south, vast and unknowable. Terra Australis incognita, they called it. The unknown southern land. Not fiction, not speculation, but recollection. The Greeks dreamed of balance, a land to mirror the continents of the north. The Hindus spoke of Uttarakhru and a realm beyond, the fire wines. The Vikings called it Ultima Thule, the furthest place where the world turns strange. Even the Dogon people of Mali, landlocked and sun-drenched, told of a place where gods came from beneath white mountains and returned to them in silence. What if this frozen wasteland was once the heart of something? Not the end of the world, but its axis. What if we've mistaken extinction for preservation? Ice does not forget. Each flake is a layer, each layer a year, every century sealed in white, and below, sealed in pressure, the bones of a story too large to fit inside our modern mind. Because history is not a line. It is a loop of ruins, masked in frost. We say Antarctica is lifeless, but life is not always something warm-blooded. There are things beneath that still breathe, not with lungs, but with memory. The magnetic pulse, the gravitational anomaly, the structure that should not be there, the lake that has never seen the sky. These are not mysteries. They are fractures. There was a time the earth tilted differently, not a metaphor, a fact. The axial shift, the crust displacement, a world suddenly rotating off-center. What froze may not have been land, but the memory of what stood upon it. Legends from every hemisphere speak of a flood, of a people who vanished, of a kingdom beneath the waves, beneath the ice, beneath time. But what if Atlantis did not sink into the sea? It rose into the cold. What if the gods who fled the deluge did not die, but migrated, not east, not west, south? To look at a map is to lie to oneself. Lines drawn by men who never walked the places they named. There is no center, only blindness wearing the crown. Because beneath the white is something black, not evil, not malevolent, but unknown. The continent is shaped like a question, a riddle that civilization never solved, it only silenced. They say Antarctica was discovered in 1820. But how then? Was it mapped in 1513? And how was it mapped? Ice-free. How did ancient cartographers, Ottoman, Chinese, Egyptian, depict coastlines they should never have seen? Why do pyramids repeat their forms in the south? Why do structures appear in satellite scans only to vanish when approached? History teaches in whispers, but we've been trained to hear only the screams. Antarctica has no cities, no kings, no gods, and yet the treaties say no one can own it. The governments say no one may dig too deep. The ice is to remain untouched. Why? Because this is not land. It is a vault, a crypt, a womb. Something sleeps here, not a creature, not a being, but a memory. We ask ourselves, what if we're not the first? But the better question is, what if we were never supposed to remember? What if the veil of snow is not nature's doing, but humanity's defense? Because if the world remembered what was lost, it would have to remember why civilizations fall, not only to fire, but to frost, to forgetting, to deliberate silence. Antarctica did not vanish, it was sealed. Imagine a world before the ice, mountains green with moss, rivers flowing where now only glaciers stretch, cities built of stone, not found on any modern continent, columns that absorbed the sky, temples that vibrated with light, not sound. Imagine a priesthood that measured the stars from the pole and wrote their records into the earth itself. What if they saw the flood coming? What if they prepared, not with escape, but with burial? The ancients were not primitive, they were pre-modern, a different intelligence, one we no longer recognize because we've mistaken electricity for understanding. We've mistaken progress for wisdom. But they knew cycles. They read the sky not for curiosity, but for warning. They understood the poles would shift, the ice would return, and one day it would melt. What lies beneath is not evidence, it is prophecy. We were never meant to own this place, only remember it. But memory is a fragile thing when left in the hands of men. So Antarctica remembers for us, layer by layer, breath by breath, still, frozen, waiting, and still. The silence grows louder. We feel it in the tremors of hidden quakes, in the sudden no-fly zones, in the stories that disappear from the news, in the scientists who stop speaking, in the eyes of those who return from the white. Different because Antarctica is not just a place, it is a veil, and every year that veil thins. They buried it well, but not perfectly. Cracks appear, maps leak, ice melts, and underneath, a story is waking. We descend further, not into geography, but into memory, because this is what Antarctica is, a continent of amnesia, a land not lost, but deliberately removed. There are stories that do not fit the world we've built, stories of warmth where there should have been ice, of civilizations without metal, yet building in stone more precise than our own, of migrations southward, not by accident, but by design. What if the southernmost land was once the final destination of the first exodus? Ancient Sanskrit texts whisper of Shambhala, a radiant realm hidden in the inaccessible places of the earth. Greek lore speaks of Hesperides, the garden at the edge of the world. The Mayans of a polar origin, a beginning, where the white breath lives. And in fragments of Aboriginal cosmology, there are songs of beings that emerged from the ice, sang the world into form, and returned below when their work was done. These are not fables, they are echoes, distorted, reshaped, layered with symbol. but rooted in something real, something older than writing, older than us. What if Antarctica is the origin point? Not the cradle of life, but the shelter of knowledge, a final refuge for what the world was never meant to forget. Some believe the Earth was once circled by a band of advanced civilizations, Atlantean, Lemurian, Pre-Sumerian, all connected, all destroyed, but not all lost. A few may have fled to a place untouched by war, hidden by ice, sacred by design. They encoded their memory in architecture, not books, not screens, but stone, magnetic fields, crystalline harmonics. They knew that knowledge written in symbols can be destroyed, but knowledge built into the planet survives. There are whispers among the quiet few who have walked the continent's spine, of structures seen only once, of perfectly rectangular ridges beneath thousands of feet of ice, of radar shadows that resemble ziggurats buried like hearts within glaciers, of machinery heard humming where there should be only wind. These tales are dismissed. The people who tell them discredited the footage, lost, and yet the whispers persist. Because even in silence, some truths resonate. Why the global secrecy? Why the unbreakable treaties? Why the science stations ringed like fortresses? Why are some satellite feeds redacted, not for military purposes, but for stability? They say Antarctica is too remote, too cold, too desolate to matter, and yet they guard it with laws, with silence, with time. It is the only land on Earth where war has never been waged, the only continent declared off-limits to the world's most powerful nations. That is not coincidence, that is containment. And maybe the most haunting thought isn't what's buried, but who buried it. Was it us? A forgotten version of ourselves, more in tune, more divine, more whole? Or was it something else entirely, something older, something that shaped humanity once and then stepped away, leaving us to remember or to forget? And maybe they're still watching, from beneath, from behind the veil, waiting to see what we become when the ice melts, because the ice is melting faster than predicted, faster than admitted. It retreats like a curtain, and with each year, more of the stage is revealed. We've seen it before, fragments on radar, buried forests, strange formations. We'll see it again unless it's covered up again. But truth has a pulse, and it's getting louder. This is not the beginning of the story. It is the threshold. We stand at the gates of something we were never meant to touch, and yet something inside us remembers the shape of this silence, the chill that doesn't come from cold, but from recognition. Something inside us knows. We've been here before. Maybe the flood didn't take everything. Maybe some memories froze, and now they thaw. Not all at once, but in slow fractures, in dreams, in whispers, in ruins glimpsed beneath the white. And what waits beneath? A city, a machine, a temple, a story. No one knows, no one will say, but something does wait, not lost, not dead, only sealed, and the seal is cracking. The Piri Reis Enigma in the silence between centuries. There are things that do not belong, maps drawn with impossible precision, lines etched by hands that should not have known what they knew. Truths captured, not with satellites, but with memory, ancient, scattered, and forbidden in 1513. On the smooth surface of gazelle skin, an admiral of the Ottoman fleet laid out a vision of the world that should not have been. Piri Reis, a man of the sea, of empire, of war, but also a collector of echoes. What he drew was not merely coastline, it was contradiction. A world mapped centuries before it was found. A land known before it was known. Antarctica, ice-free. They say it was a collage, fragments of older maps, sewn together from forgotten sources. Reis himself claimed this. Ancient charts from seafarers, long dead, Greek, Arabic, Indian, maybe Atlantean. But when the ink settled, it revealed something that scholars still cannot comfortably explain. A representation of South America, with uncanny accuracy, and beneath it, a southern continent, jagged, concave, detailed, not a fantasy, not a blob of terra incognita, but a specific shape, the shape of Queen Maud Land, the coastline of Antarctica, drawn 500 years before we officially discovered it, and drawn without the ice. Modern science says that region has been under ice for at least 6,000 years. But the Piri Reis map shows no such covering. It reveals rivers, bays, inlets, features that could only be known if someone had seen it before the Great Freeze. How? Not with guesswork, not with magic, but with memory. Somewhere, someone had mapped this land when it was still alive, when the ice had not yet sealed the gates, when Antarctica was not deathly white, but vibrant and green dot to the mainstream. It's just a coincidence, an accidental alignment, a trick of the eye. But how many coincidences does it take before a pattern becomes a revelation? This is not the only ancient map with knowledge it should not possess. The Orientius Phineas map, 1531, also shows Antarctica with river systems. The Boischet map, 1737, depicts a subglacial topography we didn't confirm until the late 20th century. None of these cartographers had access to sonar, radar, or satellite data, but all drew something we would not recognize for hundreds of years. They were not imagining, they were remembering. There is a pattern here, not just in geography, but in erasure. The further back we go, the clearer the past becomes, until a certain point, and then silence, a rupture. It's as if a whole chapter of human history was torn out, and only scattered remnants remain, hiding in artwork, in scripture, in maps drawn on animal skin. The Piri Reis map is not a relic. It is a surviving page of a forgotten book, a book that may have been written before the flood and rewritten after. What if this was not the work of one admiral, but of many hands, across many lifetimes? What if these maps were not guesses, but transcriptions of documents passed down through empires, now buried? Think of the library of Alexandria. Think of the mystery schools of Egypt, the cartographic halls of Carthage, of Tenochtitlan, of Samarkand. Knowledge burned, looted, drowned. And yet, fragments survive, because truth cannot be destroyed, only hidden. Some believe the maps came from a civilization long vanished, a seafaring people who circumnavigated the world before the pyramids rose. They would have known the continents, known the stars, known the tilt of the earth before it shifted, known that Antarctica was not always a prison of ice, and if they mapped it, they may have lived there. We often speak of Atlantis, a civilization said to have vanished in a single day and night. But what if Atlantis was not just one place, but many, a global web of knowledge centers? And as the waters rose, those who survived scattered some to the mountains, some to the deserts, and some to the ice. Antarctica, as a final vault, a refuge not just for people, but for memory. The map may be our only remaining link, an accidental breadcrumb left in plain sight, and yet few dare to follow it. Why? Because to believe the Piri Reis map is accurate means accepting that our entire timeline is wrong, that there were eyes before ours, ships before ours, empires that measured the earth before history was even written. That's not revision, that's revelation. Even the U.S. Air Force in the 1960s took note, studied the maps, confirmed their shocking accuracy, and then silence, because to accept the implications is to collapse the story we've been told. That civilization began in Mesopotamia, that we advanced in a straight line, that everything before the last 6,000 years was darkness. But the maps whisper another truth. Cartography is not imagination, it is measurement. And to measure a land, you must walk it, sail its coasts, know its contours. So someone did before the glaciers, before the seals and the silence. Someone mapped what we forgot, the ink on the gazelle. Skin may have dried in 1513, but the memory it holds is far older, not just of a continent, but of a world that breathed in rhythms we no longer understand, a world that may have fallen, but did not vanish. And if the map survived, what else was preserved? What else waits beneath the white, drawn not in ink, but in stone? Then we follow the ink deeper, not for what it shows, but for what it implies. Because this was never just a map, it was a fracture, a rupture in the official timeline, a moment when the truth bled through. When Piri Reis traced his pen across the parchment, he didn't just draw coastlines, he outlined the shadow of a forgotten world, a geography out of place, an origin no longer allowed to be spoken aloud. And yet it's there, etched in curves too precise for chance, too detailed for guesswork. Queen Maud land before the ice, dot before erasure. And if that detail survived, what of the rest? What of the cities that once stood on that coast? The ports, the temples, the archives, are they buried in the same silence that covers the land? Some say the knowledge came from before the younger Dryas, before the comet, before the sky fell, from a civilization that knew its time would end, one that passed down its knowledge, not just in story, but in measurement, encoded not in language, but in proportion. Latitude, a forgotten grid, etched onto the world like a scar. It is a terrifying thought, not because it is unbelievable, but because it is entirely possible. The only thing more fragile than a lost city is a map that remembers it, and yet we treat it like trivia, an anomaly, a curiosity in a museum of strange. But those who look closer see the pattern, the consistency, the quiet recurrence of truths that do not belong where we find them, like a warning dot or a promise. In every age, there are gatekeepers, not always out of malice, but out of fear. The fear that the world is older than we are ready to accept. The fear that what we call civilization is just the latest attempt. The fear that beneath our empires lie others, more advanced, more in tune, more complete. And in that fear, the maps are hidden, the scrolls burned, the questions silenced. Because if the past is not what we thought, then neither is the future. And still the map survives, silent, waiting, not to be believed, but to be seen. Because belief is not required, only memory, a deep remembering, the kind that wakes in dreams, that stirs in the blood when ancient names are spoken, that rises like mist when we see lines on a page that do not fit, and yet feel right. The Piri Reis map is not the beginning. It is a doorway, a cut in the fabric, a place where the veil thinned just enough, and once you see it, you cannot go back, because if this one map is real, then the flood was real, then the warnings were real, then the gods that fled south were real, then the ice was never meant to last. It melts now, not just the physical frost, but the intellectual freeze, the imposed forgetting, the calculated silence. And as it melts, the old maps begin to breathe again. The old stories begin to rise. The coastlines shift, not just on Earth, but in the mind. We are not discovering, we are remembering. So what else waits beneath the white? Another map, a chamber, a signal, or maybe nothing but stone, silent and cold. And yet, even stone remembers. The next time someone says, "We've already mapped the world," ask them if they've seen the maps we weren't meant to, the ones drawn in darkness, in exile, in defiance, the ones that tell us we were not the first to draw the earth. Lake Vostok, the sea beneath Isom. Truths do not rise in fire. They lie still. They wait in silence. Frozen, not in time, but in intention. Lake Vostok is not a lake in the way we imagine. It is an abyss sealed in crystal, a sea without sky, buried beneath 2 miles of unbroken Antarctic ice, a tomb of water older than memory. For over 15 million years, nothing touched it. No sun, no wind, no surface breath, or still does. They say the lake was discovered in the 1990s, but discovery is a fragile word. Russian scientists had long suspected the existence of liquid water beneath the surface, a hidden subglacial world beneath Vostok Station, a thermal anomaly, a body of water stretching over 12,000 square kilometers, larger than Lake Ontario, pressurized, insulated, unreachable dot until 2012. That was the year the drill pierced through. The world waited for data, for images, for samples, for truth, and then nothing. The story fell into silence. The samples, taken with care and ceremony, were removed from headlines. What was found was not revealed, at least not to us. What did they see beneath the ice? The official story speaks of extremophile microbes, resilient organisms capable of surviving in near-boiling sulfur vents or freezing methane caves, creatures adapted to environments where life should not thrive. But the whispers tell a different story, of structures seen on sonar, of magnetic anomalies beneath the lakebed, localized distortions that defy standard geophysical explanation, of voices not heard but felt. Satellite imagery has captured bizarre grid-like patterns near the Vostok region, straight lines, right angles, geometries too perfect for geology, coincidence, error, or the outline of something buried not by nature, but by design. It is here, under the most remote station on Earth, that something ancient remains untouched. Not just untouched by man, but untouched by time. Lake Vostok has had no contact with Earth's atmosphere since long before humans walked upright. Its ecosystem, if it exists, evolved in isolation. It may hold genetic codes found nowhere else on the planet, or perhaps it preserves something even older. We once believed Antarctica was a wasteland. Now we know better. There are more than 400 subglacial lakes hidden beneath its icy crust. But Vostok is the largest, the deepest, the most still, except for what moves beneath. In 2001, before the drill reached the lake, a strange signal was detected, a magnetic anomaly extending over 100 kilometers near Vostok. Electromagnetic patterns that did not behave like those of rock or water. Some say it's a massive deposit of iron, others a buried meteorite. But others believe it may be something far stranger, an artificial structure, ancient beyond reckoning, sending silent pulses through the ice. In myth, the deep was always sacred. Oceans were wombs, caves were gateways, lakes were mirrors. But what is a lake that no one has ever seen? What does it reflect? There are those who claim the drilling operation was not about water samples. It was about access, a test, a breach, a doorway opening for the first time in millions of years. And perhaps something looked back. Why was the project so abruptly closed? Why were the results obscured, the data fragmented, the announcements delayed? In the age of instant transparency, Vostok remains opaque, not just because of the ice, but because of the implications. What if something was found beneath the lake that should not exist? The Book of Enoch speaks of watchers bound beneath, the earth imprisoned for interfering with the course of mankind, chained beneath darkness, until the appointed time. Other traditions speak of the deep ones, beings sealed in the abyss after the flood, guardians, or prisoners, dead, or dreaming. Lake Vostok becomes more than water. It becomes memory. It becomes myth. And what of the silence that followed? In 2012, the Russian team drilled through. In 2015, the United States sent a covert delegation to review the station. By 2018, the area was cordoned, aerial surveillance restricted, flight paths rerouted. Since then, quiet, no new data, no repeat expedition, only the hum of machinery in the cold. If Vostok contains a biosphere, it could redefine biology. If it contains ruins, it could rewrite history. If it contains warnings, they have already been ignored. And if it contains memory, then we are standing on the surface of a sealed truth, a truth that was never meant to thaw. There are places on Earth that feel protected, or guarded, or cursed. Vostok is one of them. A lake that should not exist, but does. A breach that should not have happened, but did. A silence that should not persist, but deepens. And beneath it all, the unknown moves. Perhaps it is only water. Perhaps it is only ice. But perhaps it is the final archive, the last breath of a world that was frozen not by climate, but by intent. We do not dig into Vostok to find life. We dig to remember what was buried. And in doing so, we risk waking what sleeps beneath. Then let us go deeper still, past the silence, into the cold breath of what has been kept. Because beneath Vostok, we are not just drilling into ice. We are drilling into amnesia, into a story sealed so tightly it forgot how to speak. But the earth remembers, not in words, but in pressure, not in sound, but in magnetic tremors. Every frozen layer is a touch, every shift a whisper. There's an unease that haunts Vostok's perimeter, not from ghosts, but from the absence of life. No birds overhead, no known flora or fauna nearby, just the endless wind, and beneath it, stillness that feels watched. Who've worked the station have spoken of it. The dreams, the electrical interference, just aware, they are dismissed, called tired, cold. But the feeling persists, passed in low voices through research tents like a legend trying not to die. What if the lake is not merely sealed off by ice, but by design? What if it was meant to be preserved, not as a specimen, but as a sentence? Every ancient myth has a flood, but some go further. They speak of places not drowned but frozen, cities entombed in frost, not water, punishments encased in silence. Could Vostok be such a place? And then there are the maps. Before the continent was cloaked in ice, ancient eyes saw its shape. We spoke of this in the Piri Reis Enigma. But what if Vostok was a focal point? What if the ancient navigators charted it for a reason, to mark a gate, a prison, a wound? There are rumors, never confirmed, never denied, that deep radar near the lake's edge found unusual structures, not natural caverns, but angles, symmetry. Too deep, to date, too ordered to dismiss. Stories persist of a dome beneath the ice, a geodesic form, smooth and enormous, like the fossil of a thought too perfect for nature to have formed. Not quite metal. Some say it pulses, but who built it? And more importantly, why bury it beneath a lake no one could reach? Unless it wasn't built to be found, unless it was built to be sealed, not just from the world, but from time. There is a tension growing now, not in the lake, but in us. Each time we reach beneath the veil, something old begins to stir, not in anger, but in return, because the earth is not passive. It remembers its makers. It remembers its wounds. And Antarctica is not dead land. It is dreaming land, land that waited. We've built observatories near Vostok, magnetometers, antennas. We tell ourselves it's for research, to understand the Earth's field, to track reversals and poles. But maybe we're listening, maybe we're watching, maybe we're waiting for the signal to change. Some believe the ice holds prophecies, flash-frozen echoes of what once was, bacteria from stars, crystals from another epoch, encoded minerals bearing memory in frequency. If so, then drilling isn't discovery, it's violation, and what waits beneath may not be pleased. The ancients warned of places where man should not go, mountains that housed gods, caves that led to underworlds, waters too deep for soul or body to return. Perhaps Vostok is one of these, a forgotten gate, and we, the ones rattling the lock with machines, we don't fully understand what happens if we go further, deeper than samples, past protocol. What happens when the core melts and the seal breaks? What rises when the sea beneath the ice becomes sea no longer? Will it be knowledge or reckoning? We stare into Vostok, expecting answers. But what stares back may be older than the questions themselves, because sometimes truth is not something we find. It is something we awaken, and some things were buried for a reason. The Antarctic Megaliths beneath the coldest winds of Earth. Stone remembers, not in words, not in sound, but in shape, in angle, in rhythm. There is a language that predates script, older than ink, older than kings. It is a language spoken in monoliths, in lines that stretch for miles, in stones too heavy to move, yet somehow moved. We've seen this language before, etched across the Andes, the Giza Plateau, the temples of Angkor. But now it speaks again, from beneath and silence. In 2012, a curious image made its rounds through restricted satellite archives. Aerial shots, captured just after a rare surface melt, revealed something out of place. Not cracks, not hills, but geometry. Ridges aligned in unnaturally straight lines, shadow-cast angles that formed rectangles and circles, not the chaotic scattering of rock, but the suggestion of intent, of order. Mainstream voices call it pareidolia, the mind's hunger to see patterns where none exist but others. Hesitate, because those angles echo things we've seen before. Cusco, Sacsayhuaman, Göbekli Tepe, stone circles in the Altai spiral formations. On Easter Island, always the same motifs, always the same impossible masonry, always the same question. Who taught the earth this language of stone? We thought Antarctica was exempt from this code, that its ice erased all traces of man. But what if the opposite is true? What if the ice preserved the original dialect, the root tongue of a forgotten civilization, not vanished, but frozen mid-sentence? Consider this. At least 3 anomalous formations have been identified near the Queen Maud Land sector. 2 resemble concentric circles, reminiscent of the sacred layouts of Rapa Nui and the temple complexes of Malta. The third, a massive rectangular shadow over a ridge, shows dimensions that mirror the golden ratio dot from space. It looks like the layout of a city. From Earth, it vanishes beneath the snow. The pattern is too symmetrical, too intentional, too loud to be a mistake. And then there is the stone itself. In certain areas where rock breaches through thinning glaciers, the composition is not what it should be. Granite that doesn't match the surrounding terrain, boulders with magnetic properties anomalous to their location, cuts that appear to clean, surfaces too smooth, fissures that look less like erosion and more like instruction, tools, heat-based, frequencies. The ancients spoke of a lost southern land, Terra Australis, Ultima Thule, a place where the gods fled when the world was drowned. Could these megaliths be the footprints of that retreat? If so, then Antarctica is not just a continent, it's a tomb, a cathedral, a blueprint etched in ice. Across Peru, the stones of Ollantaytambo fit with precision impossible to replicate today. In Baalbek, Lebanon, the trilithon stones each weigh over 800 tons, unmoved by even modern cranes. In Egypt, aligned with the stars, the Great Pyramid hides sonic secrets in its chambers. Now imagine a culture predating them all, one that seeded these techniques across the earth, a civilization, not local, but planetary. One whose final script was buried in the south. This theory was once whispered as lunacy, but now the alignments speak. Some of the Antarctic formations point not to magnetic north, but to solstices. Some align with ancient star systems long tracked by Mesopotamian priests, and one faint, almost erased, appears to form a direct triangulation with Giza and Teotihuacan. Coincidence or memory? They didn't just build upward, they mapped downward. Through stone, through silence, the megaliths are not just structures, they are instruments, designed not just to stand, but to hum, to vibrate, to remember. And this is why the Antarctic anomalies matter. Because if the same pattern appears here beneath, ice untouched for 12,000 years, then the story we've told about human history is fractured. shattered. It would mean we didn't start in Sumer. We didn't begin in Egypt. We are the aftermath, the survivors, the descendants of something we no longer understand. And the stones were left not as monuments, but as memory anchors to hold the world in place while we forgot. So the question rises, what else is buried beneath the Antarctic crust? And why is it forbidden to go deeper? Treaties, no-fly zones, classified research, unacknowledged expeditions. Why is a continent so lifeless, so heavily guarded? Because maybe it isn't lifeless at all. Maybe it's sacred, or cursed, or simply waiting. Maybe these megaliths weren't ruined by time, but hidden from it. Because if their meaning is unlocked, if their language is heard again, then we won't just rewrite history, we'll remember it. And maybe that's what they fear most. Then listen closely, because the stone still speaks, and its final word may not yet be written. In 2017, higher resolution satellite scans over Princess Elizabeth Land revealed something strange. A 400-foot wide oval depression ringed by stone-like ridges. The formation bore striking resemblance to Stonehenge, not in size, but in symmetry. But what made it stranger was that it was almost entirely buried. Only the ghost of its shape survived, as if something deep beneath was pressing upward. Not a ruin, a memory surfacing through the ice. Geologists dismissed it as glacial shaping, wind, ice, compression. But silence followed the initial discovery. The team who shared the image, they never released a follow-up. No press, no paper, no return trip. It was as if the anomaly was found, then folded into the frost again. But something doesn't sit right, because all across the planet, similar shapes surface near water, circular formations near Lake Titicaca, geoglyphs in the Arabian desert, submerged rings off the coast of Japan, and now one more. Near the pole, the deeper you look, the clearer the pattern becomes. From Machu Picchu to the Altai Mountains, from the Temple of Karnak to the lost city of Nan Madol, ancient architecture speaks in harmonic shapes, resonant curves, power, points, ley line crossings. Stone isn't placed at random, it's encoded. But who taught this code? And why would such sacred geometry echo beneath Antarctica? Unless it was a central node, a key in the grid, a frozen Rosetta Stone that, if awakened, could realign something far older than empire. What if Antarctica was not just a refuge, but the heart, the place where the Great Migration ended, where the last high priests of a dying world encoded the truth in granite and basalt, then let the snow bury it until we were ready to see again? And perhaps that moment is near. The ice is melting, year by year, mile by mile, and with each retreating glacier, a secret exhales. But be warned, not all memories are kind. Not all knowledge was meant to survive. Some ruins were buried for a reason. Some truths were locked in ice to keep the fire from returning. We've stared too long at the stars, hoping they'd answer us. But maybe the answer was always here, not above, below, waiting, beneath stone, beneath snow, beneath silence. And now that silence begins to crack, the map is not above us, it is beneath our feet, and it leads south, where the ice remembers everything we forgot. Operation Highjump, the war for ice. They called it an exercise, a post-war training mission, they said, a way to test cold weather gear, deploy troops, and evaluate logistics in the harshest environment on Earth. But how many training missions? Send 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft to the end of the world. How many missions return early, cloaked in silence, with commanders whispering of enemies that could move faster than any known machine? And how many of them vanish from memory, not with time, but by design? This is not a story about frostbite and frozen winds. This is the ghost of a war that may never have ended. After World War II, the victors divided up the world, but not all the maps were redrawn. Some were burned, some were buried, and one, perhaps, was left untouched, the blank white continent at the bottom of the globe. In August 1946, Admiral Richard E. Byrd, a decorated naval officer, Arctic explorer, and Freemason, was given full command of Operation Highjump. It was the largest military deployment to Antarctica in human history. Ostensibly, it was a peaceful operation to test equipment and expand the U.S. presence on the icy frontier, but its scale told another story. Destroyers, aircraft, carriers, submarines, surveillance planes, supply ships loaded with months of provisions. Why would such overwhelming force be required in a place with no enemies, no cities, no known life? Unless the enemy wasn't known or wasn't human. There are whispers buried in journals, hinted in testimonies, smuggled through redacted transcripts. Whispers that something was seen in the sky. That strange aircraft, impossibly fast, impossibly agile, rose from beneath the ice and engaged the fleet. That what was encountered in the southern hemisphere did not belong to the 20th century. It belonged to something older or something else. Admiral Byrd's own post-mission comments, cryptic and disjointed, seemed to hint at this in a Chilean newspaper interview. He warned that America must prepare to defend against flying craft that can fly from pole to pole with incredible speed. He spoke not of the Soviets, not of war, but of something beyond the human domain. Within weeks, Operation Highjump was abruptly terminated, months ahead of schedule. No clear reason was given. No public debrief was made. Only silence, followed by classified archives. If we strip away the myth, what remains? If this was just an exercise, why did it leave so many questions unanswered? And if it wasn't, what was being tested? Or more precisely, who was being warned? Some believe Operation Highjump was less of an expedition and more of an invasion. That deep beneath the Antarctic ice lay hidden technologies and hidden inhabitants. According to suppressed documents and fringe testimony, elements of the Third Reich may have escaped into the southern wastelands during the fall of Berlin, not to hide, but to continue, to establish something, a last outpost, a final stronghold of strange alliances and black science. Theories emerged, half fantasy, half confession, of Base 211 near Noi, SCHWABENLAND, a fortress city carved beneath the ice, powered by unknown forces, linked not just to secret weaponry, but to something far older, ancient ruins, vast caverns, and machines that defied time. If such a base existed, was Operation Highjump sent to find it or to silence it? The connection between ancient Antarctica and Nazi esoterica runs deep, far beyond the post-war shadows. The Thule Society, which influenced many within Hitler's inner circle, believed in an ancient polar origin of the Aryan race. They spoke of Hyperborea, a land of giants, wisdom, and radiant energy. They believed that beneath the poles, a gateway could could be found, to something buried or something beyond. These weren't just myths to them. They acted on them. They searched, and perhaps they found more than they could understand. If the Reich's true prize wasn't territory but technology, what ancient force did they awaken in Antarctica? And what did Operation Highjump walk into? There are strange reports, eyewitness accounts sealed in vaults, later leaked, then buried again. Pilots who claimed to encounter saucer-like craft rising vertically from the ice. Craft that emitted no heat signature, no conventional propulsion, but moved with intelligence and intent. Men who saw nothing, but returned changed. One sailor wrote that the ice screamed, another that something old watches beneath. Their journals were never published, their accounts dismissed as trauma or frostbite fever, but the pattern repeats. They didn't vanish, they were erased, silenced, hidden. If there was a war, it wasn't just a military one, it was psychological, mythic, a clash between the modern world and the relics of a civilization that refused to stay dead. Some believe the mission awoke something, others that it was too late and they had simply walked into a realm already claimed. What if the ice wasn't the enemy? What if it was the vault? Consider the sudden global shift after 1947, the founding of the CIA The Roswell incident, the explosion of interest in UFOs, not as extraterrestrial, but as hidden technologies. The National Security Act, the rise of black budget programs, the sealing of polar maps, the Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1959 by 12 nations, forbidding military activity, mineral extraction, and even unsupervised exploration. Why such extreme caution in a place where nothing was supposed to live? Look again at the timing. Operation Highjump ends in early 1947. Within months, Bird is muzzled. Then the crashes begin. Then the cover-ups. Then the silence returns. And Antarctica becomes not a frontier, but a forbidden zone. A place protected not by walls, but by absence. By memory suppression. By geopolitical agreement that says, you may not look here. You may not remember what was seen. You may not ask, but the questions still rise, like heat beneath the ice. Why send an armada into the cold? Why return without glory? Why bury the story if it was just a routine? Unless it was never a mission of conquest, but a reckoning. In later years, Admiral Byrd spoke little. His private diaries, some say, contradict the official reports. Others say those diaries were forged. But what cannot be faked is the shape of history around that void. Something happened in Antarctica in 1947. Something enough to alter policy, shape secrecy, and build a wall of forgetfulness taller than any monument. Something we were not meant to find or not meant to disturb. Perhaps Antarctica is not where history ends, but where it sleeps, where wars not recorded in textbooks were fought and lost and buried, where the ice is not absence, but armor, an Operation Highjump. It may have been the first knock on a door that should have stayed closed, and yet the knock was heard, not by the world, but by something beneath it. A resonance awakened, then quickly smothered. But echoes, even through ice, do not die. They hum in magnetic distortions picked up by orbiting satellites. They flicker in unexplained energy bursts reported near the South Pole. They linger in anomalies, places where compasses spin, where gravity bends, where silence grows too loud. Modern science calls it geothermal flux, but ancient memory names it differently. Somewhere beneath the frozen ceiling of the world, a pulse still beats, an old intelligence, a dormant force, a warning, or a waiting. Operation Highjump may have failed in its official goals, or perhaps it succeeded in its unspoken one, to map the edges of a sealed reality, to mark the coordinates of a myth still alive, not for conquest, but for containment, for control. The moment we stepped foot on Antarctica, we crossed into something timeless, a veil between what was and what is not meant to be remembered. What bird witnessed may never be disclosed, but in the curvature of radar signals, the redacted reports, the trembling words of a seasoned explorer, something flickers, something ancient. What if Antarctica was never just a continent? What if it was a citadel, not built, but buried, not lost, but locked, and we, armed, proud, and blind, sent steel ships to scrape at its gates, only to find we were not the first, and we would not be the last. DNA Anomalies in the ice-coursed time does not live in hours. It freezes in layers, pressed into silence by the weight of centuries, by the hush of snowfall, unbroken for 1,000,000 dawns. The ice does not forget. It remembers the breath of forests that no longer exist. It remembers the heat of suns before ours, and remembers blood, not flowing, fossilized, not human, but close, close enough to stir something in our marrow, far enough to frighten the guardians of consensus, for buried in the white strata of Antarctica, locked beneath pressure older than civilization, lies DNA. That doesn't belong. We call them ice cores, vertical relics of time, bored down into the polar crust like needles through memory, each ring a year, each dark line a storm, each trapped bubble a whisper from before we had names for sky or fire. From these cores, we learn the shape of forgotten climates, volcanic winters, magnetic shifts, great droughts, and flooding rains. But in the deepest cores, something else emerges. Microscopic sequences, fragments of code, and some of them don't match anything we know. Not bacteria, not fungus, not plant, bird, mammal, or microbe. Something other, something before. The first signs came quietly in the early 1990s. Researchers from Vostok Station, the Russian outpost perched over the buried subglacial lake, began retrieving deep-core ice samples more than 11,000 feet beneath the surface. They expected water locked in ancient time. What they found was more complex. Hidden within those layers were DNA signatures, partial strands, incomplete, yes, but unmistakable, and among them, markers that diverged too sharply from known phylogenetic branches. Not random noise, not lab contamination, something structured, designed, preserved, a blueprint for something extinct or undiscovered. The pattern repeated from Greenland to Dome Sea, from Bird Station to the Amundsen coast. Teams began encountering anomalous nucleotide patterns at depths that predated the human story. Not fossils, not bones, but instructions, genetic echoes of life that should not have existed there, not in that time, not in that form, not beneath a continent that was, supposedly, always too cold for civilization. The official explanation: contamination, lab error, ice deformation, misread sequences, coincidence, the quiet fallback of science when the findings are too loud. But behind closed doors, some began to whisper, what if we were reading the fingerprints of a forgotten lineage? Could another branch of the human tree have thrived and been buried? Could we be tracing the DNA of a precursor species, a sister race, a fallen cousin, or something entirely different? Not Homo sapiens, not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, something we don't even have a name for, perhaps. Not because it never existed, but because its erasure was complete in 2004. An unpublished report from a joint European-Russian study hinted at mitochondrial strands found in Antarctic ice that shared less than 80% overlap with any catalogued organism. That figure, for geneticists, is seismic. It places the divergence not in the thousands of years, but in the millions, a time before us, before the Ice Age, before even the ancestors of our ancestors began to shape the world with stone. And yet, there it was, preserved in silence, not dead, not alive, just waiting. If this DNA was not ours, not from anything we've known, then whose was it? Some have looked to myth, to the bloodlines of the first race spoken of in polar myths, beings said to have emerged from light, then fallen into ice. Others point to the lost tribes beneath the pole, whispered of in secretive, Masonic and Rosicrucian texts, cryptic references to guardians of forbidden knowledge sealed in frost. Even the Hopi elders spoke of the third world, a previous earth swallowed by snow, from which only a few migrated south before the Great Purification. Could these stories be memory? Could they be genetic? Could we carry within us diluted echoes of a genome not of this current world? Symbolically, the idea is not new. Every ancient culture tells of a flood, a fall, a fire, but less spoken of is the freeze, the burial, the moment the earth itself sealed the door, covered the proof, not with water, but with stillness. And in that stillness, blood crystallized into code, and code into mystery. But even mystery leaves a trace. Some anomalies seem almost deliberate, not just mutations, but markers, sequences that behave like signatures, self-replicating patterns, geometric and ordered, as if the strands were meant to be found. Some have suggested these were engineered genomes, messages from an ancient intelligence that encoded its being into the biosphere, not as a species, but as a memory, one we would only discover once our instruments were advanced enough and our hubris high enough to cut deep into the planet's core, like opening a sealed tomb, like waking the dead. And still, the official position remains unchanged. There is nothing strange in the ice. There is no buried civilization. There are no genetic ghosts. But the data says otherwise, not with headlines, but with footnotes, not in textbooks, but in peer-reviewed margins few ever read, places where discrepancies are cataloged and quietly forgotten. But the ice remembers. It always does. What if the beings whose DNA sleeps in that ice are not gone? What if they were not wiped out, but placed in stasis? What if Antarctica is not a grave, but a vault, and what we call anomalies are signals, subtle preparations for return, a countdown, encrypted in genetic time, one we don't yet understand, but one we've already triggered? We bore into the ice, thinking ourselves gods. But what if the ice was placed there to protect us from what lies beneath? What if it is not just a climate, but a seal, not for preservation, but for containment. And every drill core is a fracture, every retrieved sample, a release not of disease, but of memory. We once believed that humanity began in Africa. Now we believe it began in the stars. But maybe, just maybe, it began in the cold, in silence, in a temple of frost, where fire was born from DNA not shaped by time, but by intention. And if that is true, then perhaps we are not the first intelligence. We are the echo, the experiment, the awakening. And what sleeps beneath the ice may not be extinct, only patient. The lost city of the Beardmore Glaciers. Some ruins are not buried in soil. They are buried in denial, erased not by time, but by silence. A silence heavy as ice, sharp as wind, old as the sky. Beneath the frozen breath of Antarctica, there are stones that should not exist. Carvings in a place no human was supposed to reach. Symbols in a language no archaeologist will name. And at the heart of it all, a city that vanished before it was believed. A city that rose once, then froze. The Beardmore Glacier cuts through the Transantarctic mountains like a scar through the continent's white skin. Rugged, remote, inhospitable, a place no myth should thrive. And yet, it is here, near this desolate stretch of ancient ice, that a story begins, a story most have forgotten, or were told to forget, in the late 1920s, during a geological survey led by explorer Sir Douglas Mawson. Strange reports began to circulate. Fossils were found where no living forest should have ever grown, petrified wood, fern imprints, even skeletal remains resembling amphibians and reptiles, deep within the icebound interior. But one discovery stood apart, quietly handed down through field reports and whispered recollections. It was said that somewhere near the Beardmore Glacier, a team had uncovered architecture, cut stone, carved markers, a symmetrical, weathered cross, not a religious cross, not Christian, not Celtic, but something older, abstract, geometric, standing like a sentinel over the snow. Then, just as quickly, the site was lost, covered, dismissed. No official photographs, no maps, only second-hand accounts, and one curious detail. The artifacts were retrieved, sent north for study, and never seen again by the time Bird's famous Antarctic expeditions began in earnest in the 1930s. The rumors had already taken root in certain circles. Occult scholars, alternative historians, secret societies, theosophists whispered of a frozen Atlantis beneath the southern pole. German researchers became obsessed with ancient origins in polar regions, and South American shamans spoke of the White Land, a continent of gods swallowed by ice after defying the sky. In each of these myths, the same pattern emerges. A civilization arose where no civilization should have. It reached a pinnacle and fell in a single night, not through war, through forgetting. How do you erase a city? You don't destroy it, you bury it in snow, in silence, in maps labeled uninhabitable. But sometimes traces bleed through. In the 1940s, a New Zealand engineer named Neville Hay reportedly received a photograph from a U.S. contact, a blurry image of an angular structure rising through glacial ice, captioned only with GPS coordinates near Beardmore. He shared it briefly with colleagues, then retracted the image, calling it a hoax. When questioned years later, he denied ever receiving such a thing. But one of his associates remembered a sharp line of masonry, a triangular arch, a carved spiral sun. None of it geological, all of it architectural. Skeptics claim this is all pareidolia, the brain projecting patterns onto chaos. But what if the chaos was designed to hide the pattern? Because as we look closer, across cultures, across oceans, the whispers become harder to dismiss. The Maori speak of Pachupiori, pale-skinned sky people who came from an island of light and vanished in mist. In southern Chile, the Mapuche tell of the Injican, the divine ancestors from the land of the sky mirror, now buried beneath storm and salt. And in the highland myths of Peru, elders remember a time when the south wind brought ships of light and a people who built with cold stone that hummed like bees. All speak of a land to the far south. All speak of its fall. Could Beardmore be the last threshold, a place where memory crystallized and refused to die? Satellite imagery taken in recent years has shown angular shadows near the glacier's edge, rectangles too regular to be natural, vanishing and reappearing depending on SNOWPACK.geospectral. Scans from private satellites have detected strange heat anomalies beneath the surface, not volcanic, not tectonic, pulsing signatures. As if something beneath the ice is still active, as if the ruins are not just old, but sleeping. In 2003, an independent researcher named Amelia Croft published a speculative paper drawing parallels between stone alignments found near Lake Titicaca and grid patterns faintly visible in LiDAR sweeps of the Beardmore Basin. She proposed a southern lattice, a megalithic code extended across continents, its nodes buried under jungle, mountain, desert, and ice. Her work was quietly mocked. Her name faded from mainstream circles, but her maps found a second life online among those who collect forgotten blueprints, forbidden timelines, and puzzle pieces from a world we were never meant to reassemble. And on her map, near the southern convergence of ley lines, a single glyph is marked, Lost City. But if it was a city, who built it? Who lived there before the flood, before the freeze? Were they human or something adjacent? The scale of Antarctic architecture, if real, defies traditional timelines. To carve stone into that bedrock would require tools we barely understand. To place it precisely on energetic meridians implies knowledge not taught in any school. And if that knowledge once existed and was erased, then the ruins are not just physical, they are wounds, memories, that bled into myth and froze. There are those who believe that Antarctica was once the cradle, not of humanity as we are, but of something older, a civilization of geomancers, skywatchers, and builders of harmonic stone, whose temples aligned not with sun and moon, but with magnetism, with frequency, with consciousness itself, who left behind not just structures, but vibrations encoded into the earth, hidden in ice, waiting to be remembered by the few whose blood still sings to the stones. This is why such discoveries vanish, not because they are false, but because they are too true, because they fracture the mirror of accepted history, because they whisper of epochs without kings or chronologies, because they suggest that we are not the first or the greatest, only the latest. The Beardmore Glacier continues to move, slow, inevitable, like the memory of a forgotten truth. Each year, it grinds down mountains, carries stone to the sea, and reveals nothing. Or perhaps something, a buried step, a missing shape, a flash of symmetry where none should be. And each year the questions grow louder. Why were those ruins erased? Who decided they should not be found? And what happens if they are? Somewhere beneath the ice, a city sleeps, its towers long fallen, its maps long burned, but its purpose still breathing, still calling. And maybe that's what the glacier guards. Not stone, not artifacts, but a threshold, a veil, one that keeps us from remembering who we once were and who we still might become. Terra Australis, the empire erased from maps. There are lands we remember, and there are lands we are told to forget. Some are lost to war, to erosion, to time. Others are lost by design, before the names we know were written, before the globe was divided by flags and fractions. There was another shape, not a myth, not a mistake, but a memory carved into the oldest maps, and then erased. They called it Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. For centuries, the world believed it was real, not a ghost, not a guess, a continent, massive, anchoring the southernmost edge of the world. From ancient Ptolemaic maps to Renaissance globes, from Islamic cosmologies to Polynesian star charts, a landmass huge, white, and inhabited appears with quiet consistency. It stretched beneath Africa, beneath Asia, beneath the entire known world, and for generations, explorers were certain something was there. Something once lived beneath the southern stars. This was not wild speculation. It was conviction. Medieval scholars debated its climate, its kings, its cities. Sailors believed its mountains touched the sky. Jesuit missionaries spoke of southern kingdoms untouched by Rome or crown. And most maps, especially those between the 15th and 18th centuries, feature it proudly, not as ocean, not as empty space, but as empire, rivers, forests, even place names, beach, Lukak, Malator. What civilization gave these names to stone and shore? Who drew them? And from whose memory? The 1513 Piri Reis map, sourced from ancient sea charts, lost. Time depicts a surprisingly accurate Antarctic coastline, ice-free. The Orance fine map of 1531 presents Terra Australis as lush, green, and populated, and the Mercator globe, hailed as a pillar of cartographic truth, shows a vast southern continent with peninsulas, settlements, and annotations too detailed to invent. So why were they so confident? Why draw a land that no European had yet seen? Unless they weren't the first to see it, unless they remembered. What if Terra Australis wasn't a mistake, but a scar? What if it was not an imagined future, but a buried past? A remnant of an age before the ice, before the flood, before the forgetting, before history was divided into recorded and denied. There are fragments scattered like teeth in an old skull, oral traditions in Scaper Aboriginal Australia that speak of a race of sky people who arrived from the south, glowing with light, and vanished into the snow. Legends in South America of ships with sails of fire that returned to the sky from a land beneath the winds. And in old Zeno family records from Venice, a cryptic tale of a southern voyage, in which the explorers found not wilderness, but ruins, ruins older than any church, built from black stone, silent, cold, and enormous, not abandoned, erased. Why would a continent be removed from history? What power decides that something once believed by all should be believed by none. This is the shape of suppression. First, they dismiss the story. Then they redraw the maps. Then they erase the names. Then they erase the memory of the names. And once all memory is severed, all that remains is doubt. By the 19th century, Terra Australis had vanished from official cartography. Suddenly, maps were corrected. The southern continent was renamed, reduced, reimagined. It became Antarctica, a scientific preserve, a frozen void, a white silence. Gone were the forests, gone were the cities, gone were the empires once described by Dutch traders, Arab navigators, and indigenous storytellers. And when we look back now with modern eyes, trained on the sterile certainties of textbooks, we are told that Terra Australis was a myth, a fantasy of balance, an old world obsession. But that's not how myth works, because myth doesn't vanish, it echoes. There is pain in this kind of forgetting, not just the loss of land, but the loss of meaning, of what that land symbolized, of what it held, of who it sheltered. If there truly was once a southern empire, long before the age of conquest, what did it know? Did it survive the last cataclysm, only to be erased by the next? Or did its survivors scatter north, carrying seeds of memory? Across oceans, did they become the Viracachas of the Andes, the white-trabbed sages of Polynesia, the mythic founders whispered about in the temples of Angkor and Abydos? We speak of Atlantis, we speak of Mu, we speak of Lemuria, but Terra Australis was not mythical in origin. It was mapped, named, believed, until it wasn't, which begs a darker question. Was it hidden? Because it held something we were not meant to find, a technology, a library, a truth that could crack the foundation of historical control in the secret archives of early naval powers. There are references to inaccessible coves and geothermal lakes far inland on the polar continent. In the logs of explorers who returned broken, mad, or silent, there are fragments. The stones spoke, one scrawled. Stars below the ice, said another. These were not the ramblings of fools, they were memories, fragments of a memory older than history. Trying to come back, we must ask, what are maps, really? Coordinates or contracts? Agreements between the powerful and the powerless about what must be seen and what must remain unseen. Maps are weapons, and erasure is an act of conquest. When Terra Australis was removed, a world was not just forgotten, it was silenced. And in that silence, something still waits. Somewhere in the blinding white, beneath miles of ice and centuries of denial, the bones of an empire sleep. They do not cry out, they do not rage, they remember. They hold within them the shape of a world before this one, when continents spoke to one another through stone and light and resonance. Before the boundary between heaven and earth was sealed, before maps became cages, Terra Australis was not a mistake. It was not a miscalculation. It was a wound we were taught to ignore, a buried inheritance, a forbidden memory. And when it rises again, not as myth, but as memory, we may begin to see the world not as it is, but as it once was, and still could be. The magnetic anomaly beneath Wilkes Land somewhere, beneath the eternal white, something waits. It does not rise, it does not move, but it pulls. A presence buried so deep beneath the Antarctic crust that it cannot be seen. Only felt, not with the eyes, but with instruments, not with maps, but with disturbance. a magnetic signature so large, so circular, it disrupted the patterns of the Earth itself. They call it an anomaly, but anomalies are just truths that do not fit the narrative. In the heart of East Antarctica lies Wilkes Land, a region cloaked in ice, wind, and time, a place no explorer truly reaches, a place whose silence is older than civilization. But in 2006, satellites scanned it from above, and the Earth told a secret it had kept for millennia. Beneath 1.2 miles of solid ice, the satellites detected a gravitational distortion stretching over 300 miles in diameter, a circular mass, heavy and unnaturally dense. It was not random. It was not jagged. It was symmetrical. Something was buried there, and the Earth could not hide it anymore. NASA confirmed it quietly. No press frenzy, no explanation, just a technical phrase, mass concentration or maskin. They proposed a theory, an ancient asteroid impact, long before the dinosaurs. But not all impacts leave such perfect rings. Not all impacts sit quietly beneath magnetic haze for tens of millions of years, and not all impacts align with human myth, because some believe this was not an accident. It was a vault, a burial, a sealed chamber of something not meant to be uncovered. The circular anomaly beneath Wilkes Land does not behave like a natural scar. Its gravity shifts instruments. Its magnetic pull interferes with compasses, and at its edges, data becomes blurred. No geological feature in the region explains it. No tectonic fracture, no volcanic dome, no glacial flow. It is simply there, massive, silent, and immovable, like the remains of a forgotten city or the shell of something deeper. There are whispers, not in textbooks, but in testimonies of expeditions that went too far inland and never returned, of aircraft instruments that spun without cause, of ice-coring stations that packed up overnight, citing atmospheric instability. And there are records, classified, redacted, then leaked military logs from the 1950s referencing an electromagnetic zone of interference. Soviet reports calling it the Black Circle. American analysts simply wrote, not impact, origin unknown. What kind of object leaves a circular imprint over 300 miles wide, but no debris? What kind of structure remains perfectly centered beneath miles of ice without decay, unless it was designed to last, engineered for silence, created not to be found, but to survive? Some theorists believe the anomaly is the roof of an ancient structure, the dome of a buried facility or temple from a pre-flood civilization, not made of stone, but of unknown alloy, immune to time, resistant to scanning. They speculate it may be the remnants of a power source, a device of resonance, humming just beneath detection. Others suggest it's a gateway, not metaphorically, literally, an ancient portal, sealed after the last cataclysm, when the Earth was reset and memory was erased. This theory, wild to modern science, aligns uncannily with ancient texts. The Mahabharata speaks of flying vessels buried beneath frozen mountains. Enoch speaks of watchers bound beneath the earth until a final reckoning. The Hopi tell of a sealed place under the ice where the last world was hidden when fire swept the skies. And in the secret scrolls of Tibet, there are mentions of a city beneath the white desert, Shambhala, radiant and invisible, seen only by those who remember. Is it myth? Or is it a warning carved into memory. Patterns emerge across history, always beneath, always sealed, always circular, from the sunken rings of Atlantis, to the stone circles of Nabta Playa, to the magnetic dome of Wilkes Land. We are told to view them as separate, coincidence, geologic curiosity. But what if they are echoes of a blueprint? What if the ancients encoded their knowledge in rings, concentric, magnetic, resonant, a language of shape, not sound, a technology of alignment, not electricity, something beyond our time, but not beyond their reach? And why Antarctica? Why bury such magnitude in the most remote, inhospitable region on Earth? Unless isolation was the point, unless cold was the lock, unless ice was the veil required to keep certain memories frozen in place. In 1838, explorer Charles Wilkes, whose name the land would later bear, reported unusual compass failures near the magnetic south. He spoke of odd magnetisms in the snow and fields that devoured sound. His journals were partially censored. The rest now sit quietly in locked archives. He never returned, but the land remembered, and so did the field beneath it. Today, as climate shifts and ice begins to melt, more anomalies are appearing. Circular ridges, subglacial lakes, geometric shadows, not caused by nature. Some scientists admit, off the record, that there's more down there, something ancient, something not yet named. And in the centers of these anomalies, always the same pulse, a magnetic heart that should not exist. If it is artificial, what was its purpose? A machine, a tomb, a failsafe against a forgotten war? Or was it a message, locked beneath the ice, for those who would one day learn to listen again? Maybe it was never meant to be uncovered. Maybe we were meant to forget. But memory is not so easily erased, and the Earth has begun to thaw. We are nearing something, a moment when myth and magnetism converge, when what we dismissed as impossible begins to reshape the very foundation of history. Not in the open, not with answers, but with disturbance, with interference, with an anomaly that speaks in gravity and silence. The Wilkes landmaskin is more than a hole. It is a presence not seen, not touched, but undeniably there. A pressure on the bones of the earth, a shadow beneath our understanding, a monument that calls not with light, but with weight, never supposed to find, but we have. Now we must ask, what else is buried in that white abyss? What other anomalies wait in stillness for memory to return? Because the deeper we go, the more the ground begins to speak, and its voice does not sound like ours. Fossils that shouldn't exist, the ice was never supposed to speak, but it remembers, not in words, but in layers, in rings of time, pressed into silence. And sometimes, when we dig deep enough, the past exhales, not with stone, not with myth, but with life frozen in place, as if paused mid-breath, beneath the miles of white silence that cloak Antarctica. Something ancient stirs, not mechanical, not artificial, not organic. Fossilized leaves, perfectly preserved. Fern spores, intact, despite tens of millions of years. Chunks of petrified wood, buried beneath glaciers. Even the remnants of flesh, soft tissue from prehistoric creatures that should not exist in this cold. But they are there, not once, not rarely, again and again and again. In the 1980s, scientists from the British Antarctic Survey made a discovery along the Transantarctic mountains, fossilized wood from a coniferous forest, not crushed, not scattered, standing. Roots intact, trunks in vertical alignment, as if they had once grown under a temperate sun. The ice told a different story, one of green valleys, flowing rivers, and a thriving biome, not 100 million years ago, but much later. Evidence showed that Antarctica was still partially forested during the Eocene, long after dinosaurs fell, and long after we were told the continent had become frozen and dead. More troubling were the fossils of life forms. Ancient marsupials, unlike any found elsewhere, fragments of massive amphibians, beetles, and pollens that require warmth, humidity, and dense vegetation. And then there were the tracks found deep beneath the Willans, ice stream impressions in sediment layers, undisturbed for eons. They weren't from machines. They weren't from modern animals. They looked bipedal, precise, intentional. But there were no bones, no bodies, just the shape of a passing presence. We are told this is normal, that climates shift, that continents drift, but the story keeps changing. In a joint expedition from New Zealand and the UK drilled into the Ross Ice Shelf and found fossilized roots of trees that once grew in rich, marshy soil less than 1,000 miles from the South Pole. Their structure was complex. The ecosystem, layered, some of the roots even contained traces of fungal networks, a mycorrhizal web, suggesting intelligent cooperation among plant life. But what makes fungi thrive? Carbon, warmth, moisture, a living system, something far more advanced than the icy void we imagine today. And if life thrived in Antarctica far longer than we were taught, who or what lived alongside it? There are no temples left on the surface, no cities, no statues gazing skyward, but that does not mean there were none. The absence of stone does not prove the absence of civilization, especially when the ice is miles thick and the timelines don't match, because now we find warmth where there should be cold. Organic growth where there should be stillness, and signs of fire, of transformation buried beneath the freeze. In 2002, Russian scientists drilling into subglacial Lake Vostok retrieved microbial samples. They weren't supposed to survive there. The environment is sealed, oxygen-starved, pressurized. But what they found were DNA fragments, some known, some unclassified. An ecosystem beneath the ice, untouched by the surface world for over 15 million years, and yet thriving. Even now, microbes whisper in the darkness, warmed by geothermal vents, nourished by mineral deposits, as if life never stopped, as if the flood came. The freeze followed, but something endured. Ancient maps tell a parallel tale. The Piri Reis map, dated 1513, shows the Antarctic coast, ice-free. It traces rivers, bays, forested coastlines. Mainstream historians call it a coincidence, a mistake, a copy of older charts. But how would earlier civilizations chart a continent they weren't supposed to know existed, let alone depicted, before the ice arrived? Unless someone saw it, lived on it, named it, and passed the memory down before their world, vanished beneath snow and salt. Indigenous traditions, scattered and seemingly unrelated, also echo the impossible. The Ambori of New Zealand speak of Uru, the land of light to the south, swallowed by storms. The Yagan of Tierra del Fuego tell of Karuchinka, a paradise lost beneath the sea and sky. And Incan lore speaks of a southern kingdom where stones sang and trees glowed, abandoned after the sky grew cold and the stars fell out of rhythm. None of these tribes ever set foot on Antarctica, but they remembered it because memory flows differently in the blood. So the question is, no longer did life exist. The question is, what kind of life was it? Were we the first to build, or just the first to forget? We imagine civilization in terms of stone and steel. We search for pyramids, for metals, for ruins that mirror our own desires. But what if they built differently, with wood, with crystal, with bioorganic forms now turned to rot and silence? What if their cities were alive, not permanent, but conscious, able to vanish with the seasons, or dissolve when balance was lost? Would we even recognize their footprint? Would we see their culture in the spores we discard, in the pollen we brush aside? Maybe they knew something we didn't. Maybe they lived with the land, not above it. So, when the earth shifted, they didn't fight, they sank. And the trees we find today, buried in layers of glacial ice, are their only memorials, a forest tomb, a breathing archive of a civilization that walked between the roots and whispered to the stars. And then came the silence, the rapid cooling, the sudden extinction, the frostbite of memory. Some say it was a shift in the poles, others a comet, others still a war between the heavens and the earth. Whatever it was, it left no survivors, only fragments, fossils, leaves that should not exist, trunks that defy their latitude, creatures that require warmth, found in a place that knows only ice. Not about a tree, it's about a timeline, one that refuses to obey, one that keeps reaching out from beneath the snow to tell us you do not know the full story. And perhaps you never did, because in Antarctica, the fossils are not relics. They are witnesses, and they do not lie. They sleep, they remember, they wait. The pyramid controversies. Some shapes do not occur by chance, even in nature's chaos. Symmetry has a voice, and geometry remembers. A triangle may be a mountain, but sometimes it's more near the Shackleton Range of East Antarctica, where the winds scream like a memory too long buried. 3 peaks rise from the white oblivion. They do not sprawl like mountains often do. They do not twist or fracture, they align. Each edge holds to a near-perfect slope. Each face mirrors the others, and each stands in eerie silence, as if waiting to be named. From satellite images. They are unmistakable, pyramidal. Mainstream geologists call them nunetics, isolated peaks that pierce through the ice. Guess, they say they appear angular, but erosion, ice, and tectonics can mimic intelligence. Pareidolia. The brain seeks patterns. They are natural, random, accidental. And yet, thousands of miles away, beneath the jungles of Guatemala, in the Andean clouds, on the plains of Giza, pyramids rise with the same angles, the same forms, the same cosmic alignments. Why is it that the accidental mirrors the intentional? Why is it that buried stone echoes buried memory? In 2012, aerial photographs released by researchers sparked a firestorm online. The shapes were clear, unmistakable, 4-sided pyramids emerging from ice. Their orientation was uncanny. 2 of them mirrored the proportions of the Great Pyramid at Giza with margins that defied coincidence. One 10,000 feet high, that would make it taller than anything built by human hands in recorded history. But no one investigated. No follow-up studies, no expeditions, no deep core analysis, just silence and a curtain of cold, both literal and bureaucratic. Satellite imaging later showed something stranger. The three peaks form a near equilateral triangle, a layout long associated with sacred geometry. One aligns to true north, another to the solstice. The last points toward something buried, toward the magnetic anomaly beneath Wilkes Land. Coincidence, they said again. Yet the coincidences keep stacking like stone upon stone. Pyramids are not merely shapes, they are memories made physical, encoded with mathematics, vibration, and myth. Why do they appear across time and space in Egypt, Peru, China, Sudan, and now, perhaps, beneath the Antarctic ice? Was there once a universal code, a sacred language of stone? One passed from culture to culture, not through writing, but through alignment, through orientation, through frequency, through earth and sky. The Shackleton Pyramids, as they're now whispered about online, remain untouched. But what if they are not mountains? What if they are tombs? What if they are housings for technologies, for gods, for memories? What if, like Giza, they are markers of something deeper below? We know from GPR surveys in Egypt that the Great Pyramids sit atop older foundations, beneath the surface, chambers, voids, water channels, electromagnetic nodes. Could Antarctica hide the same? But to drill would mean to question. To excavate would mean to confess that our timeline is not secure, that history is a house of cards built on sand, and beneath that sand are pyramids of ice. Reports have circulated, unofficial but persistent, accounts from military pilots who flew over the region in the 1980s, reporting structures unlike any mountain formation. Whistleblowers from research stations claim that certain GPS coordinates in Antarctica are classified, off-limits, even to scientists. What could be hidden in ice so ancient, so distant, that even curiosity is forbidden? Perhaps the pyramids are not new. Perhaps they were known in the 16th century. The Mercator maps referenced massive, geometric landmasses in the Antarctic region, described as cities of light, swallowed by ice. One record from 1531 even describes a temple of stars at the pole built by those who survived a great cataclysm. Legends or memories. And why do these memories appear not just in Europe, but in the ancestral myths of the Ambori, the Aboriginal Australians, and the Selknam of South America, all of whom speak of star spirits fleeing south into the ice? What if Antarctica was once green? What if it held cities, not of metal or concrete, but of energy and harmonic resonance? Pyramids, not built for kings, but for climate, for consciousness, for alignment with the stars. Structures that amplified Earth's telluric fields, that spoke not through voice, but through vibration. The ancients did not build for function alone. They built as reflection of cosmos and soul. What if the Antarctic pyramids are tuning forks, buried instruments, waiting to be played once more? Then came the flood. Then came the frost. And the ones who built were erased, not by time, but by intention. Erased by those who feared what was buried. Erased by empires who rose later and rewrote the sky. Ask yourself, Why are no public missions permitted to explore those exact peaks? Why have the coordinates been buried under jargon and silence? And why do we dismiss the shape? Why do we not listen to the language of form the way ancient peoples did? Because geometry does not lie. It remembers. It sings the song of civilizations before speech, before war, before ice. Perhaps the pyramids are watching, waiting. They do not beg to be seen. They do not shout, but they echo quietly through shadows, through snow, through every mirrored triangle etched across this world. And if the day comes when the ice cracks open, if the white veil lifts and reveals not chaos, but design, will we remember? Will we recognize their silence for what it truly was? A signal, because maybe they were never mountains. Maybe they were always markers left behind by something older than memory and smarter than we dare to believe. The secret Antarctic treaty-sum agreements are signed in silence, not with fanfare, but with fear. In a world addicted to conflict, there is one place where the wars stopped, where borders dissolved, where enemies agreed without question, without argument, and almost without record. Antarctica, the only place on Earth where over 50 nations, many of them at odds, even at war, swore to lay down arms, to silence drills, to leave the land untouched. No conquest, no excavation, no claim. Why? What power could unite the Cold War's divided world? What silence was so sacred that it demanded obedience from governments addicted to secrets? What was found in the ice? In 1959, 12 nations, including the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and others, signed what would become the Antarctic Treaty System. It was sudden, unprecedented, and most of all, permanent. It locked down the continent under a strange command. No military operations, no resource extraction, no territorial claims. It banned nuclear testing, banned deployment of soldiers, banned economic development, and it opened the land only to scientific research, strictly monitored, closely circled, and rarely explained. At the height of the Cold War, when espionage saturated the world, Antarctica became the only neutral zone. Not even outer space earned that honor. No treaty in modern history has been so universally accepted or so quietly enforced. Why? Why would world powers sign away potential oil, rare metals, and strategic positioning for nothing in return? The official reason is peace, preservation, a love for science, but the ice holds older stories, older warnings, older boundaries. Some believe the treaty was not an act of preservation, but containment, that something was found or awakened in the years just before the signing, something that made ownership irrelevant, something that made secrecy necessary. In 1946, just 13 years earlier, Operation Highjump had ended in failure, officially a U.S. Navy training mission, unofficially something far stranger. Admiral Byrd returned from Antarctica early, his men shaken, his aircraft damaged. He reported enemy craft that could fly pole-to-pole at impossible speeds, technology beyond comprehension. Shortly after, Byrd was silenced, and within a decade, the treaty emerged. Could the treaty be a line drawn around a buried war? A quiet pact, not to protect the ice from us, but to protect us from what sleeps beneath it. The wording of the treaty itself is peculiar. It prohibits any measures of a military nature. Yet several nations maintain year-round research stations equipped with satellite arrays, ice-penetrating radar, and underground storage. The treaty bans resource extraction. Yet mineral surveys have been conducted in secret, then redacted. In a leaked report showed that Russian teams had discovered vast subglacial mountain ranges and geothermal anomalies near Lake Vostok. Instead of publicizing the findings, they sealed the data. Classified. Even the scientific is protected. Why such intense coordination over a frozen wasteland? The answer may lie beneath the ink of the treaty itself, in its structure. The Antarctic Treaty is not a single document. It's a system, a growing body of protocols and extensions, amended and revised behind closed doors. Some provisions remain secret. Others are reserved for security reasons. Some documents refer to uninhabitable zones. Others mention geophysical instability. Yet none provide maps, no coordinates, no open data, just trust and silence. Even more mysterious is the Madrid Protocol of 1991, a sweeping expansion of the treaty that extended the ban on mining and resource development for 50 more years, until 2048. Why delay extraction, but not forbid it forever? What do they expect to change in 2048? The ice, the politics, or the memory? Some theorists whisper of Zone X, a restricted region where aircraft are diverted, satellites are blacked out, and radar returns are distorted. It's said to be somewhere near the Prince Charles Mountains, a place where no official stations exist, where storms form unnaturally fast and disappear just as quickly. A blind spot, a scar, and one that no nation dares to touch. There's a pattern, a mystery kept hidden, not by one power, but by all. This is not censorship by conquest. This is an agreement between shadows. When did these nations ever trust one another? They didn't. But in Antarctica, they obey. If Antarctica holds nothing, why lock it down? If it holds everything, why not take it unless it's not meant to be owned or even understood? It is a memory frozen in place, a relic too powerful to disturb, a monument to something older than borders. The indigenous peoples of South America spoke of white lands to the south, ruled by sky people and glowing towers. The Mibori told of ice kings who fled the world before the flood. Early European maps showed the continent centuries before it was discovered, covered in cities, forests, and sacred geometry. And then it was gone, vanished under ice, erased from memory, rewritten as a desert. Maybe that's what the treaty really protects, not the ice, but the illusion that we know our world, that history is settled, that we are the first to reach the pole. Maybe the treaties were not written to preserve peace, but to preserve forgetting, to bury the voices in stone, to silence the angles of the pyramids, to hide the vibration of sunken temples, to cover the ancient machinery still humming below the frost in 2048 when the protocol is up for review. Will they renew the silence, or will the truth thaw? Because in the end, treaties fade, but memory returns. Ice melts, and the earth remembers, even if we're not ready to. The memory of Mu and the southern Landsby before the flood came, before the stars rearranged their patterns, before the continents drifted like sleepwalkers across an oceanic stage. There was memory, not the kind etched in paper or carved in stone, but the kind that pulses beneath the skin, ancestral, dreamlike, forbidden. They say there once was a land so vast it touched both sunrise and starlight, a place of brightness, of harmony, of strange and luminous beings. The ancients called it Mu, but Mu is not on your maps. Its ruins are not in your textbooks. It exists only in fragments, in chants, in whispered genealogies, in symbols drawn into the dirt by brown hands under ancient skies. A name too old for paper and too dangerous for history. Across the islands of the Pacific, the memory still hums. In Polynesia, they speak of Hiva, a sunken homeland beyond the edge of visibility. In the Marquesas, in Rapa Nui, in Hawaii, they speak of ancestors who came from a great land to the south, a place swallowed by the ocean and the sky, south, always. South, the Vedic texts, among the oldest surviving records of human myth, tell of Svarga, a radiant land of divine technology and celestial hierarchy. Some interpret it as heaven, others see it as a forgotten geography, lost beneath the crushing weight of time, war, and ice. In Mayan codices, long since burned by fire and conquest, there were whispers of Tamontian, the place of origin, a primordial land, now inaccessible, where sky beings and feathered serpents taught the arts of civilization. And then there is the Mahabharata, speaking not only of war and dharma, but of flying machines, great cities, and oceans that consumed the world in a single night. What if these are not separate stories? What if they are pieces of the same shattered mirror, scattered by floods, fractured by migration, encoded into song, syllable, and symbol, a puzzle of fire, water, and ice? We are told Mu was merely a fantasy, the invention of colonial dreamers and pseudoscientists in the 19th century. But they did not invent the myths. They only tried to name them. Colonel James Churchward, who popularized the term Mu, claimed he accessed ancient Nakul tablets hidden in temple vaults of India and Tibet. The text spoke of a continent destroyed in a single night, a land of enlightenment, where humanity began, and from which survivors fled to seed Egypt, Peru, and Asia. His claims were dismissed, but the echoes were older than him, older than language. Let us not argue over names. Let us follow the wind of the myth itself, because across every continent we find the same enigma: pyramids, serpent gods, sky teachers, floods, and always the memory of a great disappearance. Mu is not just a lost place. It is a forbidden thought, an ancient heresy that says we were once more than we are now, and beneath the Antarctic ice, that heresy may yet sleep. Satellite scans of the southern pole have revealed anomalies, not just geographic, but structural, gravitational shifts, angular formations, magnetic dissonance, whispers of something buried. There are those who suggest that Antarctica is not merely a frozen desert, but the bones of an erased empire, a southern branch of the same primordial culture remembered as Mu. Consider this: if a global civilization once flourished tens of thousands of years ago, predating the rise of Sumer, Egypt, and even Göbekli Tepe, it would have existed during a radically different climate. Antarctica then may not have been covered in ice. It may have been temperate, green, inhabitable. Fossilized ferns, trees, and even footprints suggest this isn't fantasy, it's paleoclimatology, and the sudden freezing, not natural, not gradual, a rapid glaciation. as if something fell from the sky or rose from the sea to lock the continent in silence. In Maori oral history, there is a story of Te Ika Mui, the fish of Mui, hauled from the ocean, a land that emerged, then drowned again. The Hopi speak of multiple worlds destroyed by ice, fire, and water, each world wiped clean so a new one could begin. The Andean people of Lake Titicaca speak of Verakaka, the creator, emerging from the south, from the sea, or perhaps the snow. Over and over, the directions twist and weave back to the same sacred compass point. The white south, not empty, not lifeless, but concealed. Is it so strange to think that Antarctica might once have held cities, temples, libraries of memory now turned to crystal beneath a mile of frozen grief? And if so, who buried them, nature or design? There is an old Polynesian saying, "He who forgets the canoe forgets the stars." Perhaps Mu was the canoe, and Antarctica the stars. Perhaps we were not meant to forget, but forced to, flooded not only by water, but by falsehood. Imagine it, a network of ancient lands, Mu in the Pacific, Atlantis in the Atlantic, Lemuria in the Indian Ocean, all part of a world before the world, a time when humanity knew the stars as maps and the earth as memory, a time when Antarctica was not exile, but origin. What happens to a civilization when its axis is shifted, when the land beneath its feet is pulled into eternal winter, when all that it once was becomes myth? Perhaps it begins again in pieces. Perhaps we are the pieces, and in our dreams, our doubts, our strange and sudden longing for something ancient, we remember Dot. We remember the light that came from the south, the cities carved from ice and gold, the songs that named the stars before telescopes, not as fantasy, but as fracture. We were not the first, and we are not the only ones to have forgotten somewhere. Beneath the white silence, the bones of a forgotten empire still hums, still vibrate with a truth older than conquest. And if Mu ever lived, it did not drown, it froze. Then let us descend deeper into the ice of memory, into the marrow of myth, because frozen things do not die. They wait, and Antarctica, that silent vault of wind and time, may not be a grave, but a library. One of the most curious fragments comes not from archaeologists or linguists, but from cartographers, those who map what is, and sometimes what was. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513, depicts the northern coast of Antarctica, without ice, rivers, mountains, inlets, features that were only confirmed by modern sonar in the 20th century. The map predates the continent's official discovery. It shouldn't exist, and yet it does. Piri Reis claimed his source maps came from ancient seafarers older than Alexander. Fragments copied from fragments, ghosts copied by hand. And who were these sailors? Where did they learn to navigate the globe long before compasses or chronometers? Was it memory or inheritance? Perhaps the people of Mu had no need for north and south. Perhaps their temples were aligned not to geography, but to frequency, built not to withstand time, but to endure its forgetting. And now, beneath Beardmore Glacier, beneath Wilkes Land, beneath Lake Vostok, they sleep, their blueprints encoded in ley lines, their DNA entombed in cores of ice 1,000,000 years deep, waiting not to be found, but to be remembered. because the southern lands do not speak in stone alone. They speak in myth, in music, in the inexplicable ache we feel when standing before a vast ocean, wondering what was taken from it. We may never unearth the cities of Mu. The tides of time are cruel, and the custodians of truth even crueler. But we can recognize the pattern, the repetition of origin myths from Peru to Polynesia, the ancient warnings of fire and flood, the southern orientation of vanished gods. We can trace the lines beneath the lies, and if we do, we might begin to see not an isolated legend, but a buried whole, not a sunken island, but the shattered face of a forgotten world. And in the quietest moments between breath and dream, we may hear it calling back, not as prophecy, not as proof, but as a memory we were never supposed to keep. Atlantis wasn't the beginning, it was just the first to drown. Mu didn't vanish, it was veiled, and beneath the southern ice, something still remembers. The serpent lines beneath the ice there are patterns we were never meant to notice. Lines too long to walk, too ancient to name, etched into the earth beneath 2 miles of Antarctic ice, where no man was ever meant to tread. They call them ridges, or melt channels, or glacial scars. But some who've seen the satellite data don't see erosion. They see intent, snaking patterns, winding across the frozen void, unbroken, symmetrical, deliberate, not random, but remembered, because beneath every age of ice, there was something older beneath it, and in the cold silence where the wind no longer speaks, only the earth remembers what was once drawn across her skin. We call them serpent lines. They twist and coil beneath the Antarctic ice sheet in formations too long, too aligned, too unnaturally consistent to dismiss, and when overlaid with the mythic ley lines of the ancient world lines, said to carry energy, memory, and sacred direction, something unsettling emerges. They match, not precisely, but poetically, in the way thunder echoes the lightning that caused it. Could Antarctica, too, have once been part of the ancient current? Could these serpent lines have formed a circuit, a network, a map? And if so, what did they power? What did they protect? Because the snake in every ancient culture was never just a snake. It was the guardian of gateways, the whisperer of time, the keeper of knowledge buried too deep for ordinary minds to unearth. In Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent. In Egypt, the coiled Urius. In Sumer, the entwined dragons of Ningishita. In Vedic lore, the Nagathos, who lived underground, radiant with forbidden wisdom. Always the same archetype, always winding, always waiting. The lines beneath Antarctica mimic this myth. And if these formations are more than glacial flukes, if they are the buried echoes of something once alive, once known, then perhaps we are not looking at mere earthworks. Perhaps we are tracing the spinal cord of a forgotten consciousness. Some have theorized these lines once connected global energy centers, what the ancients called nibbles of the world: Göbekli Tepe, Giza, Lake Titicaca, Uluru, were they once linked by harmonic pathways, by telluric currents pulsing through the earth like veins of stone. And if the Antarctic serpent lines were once part of this network, then their burial wasn't an accident. It was an amputation, a deliberate silencing, because in the mythologies of destruction Atlantis, Mu, Zep Tepe, there's always a cataclysm, but perhaps that cataclysm was not just water or fire. Perhaps it was forgetfulness itself, a surgical erasure of memory, of alignment. And with the fall of that grid, the fall of consciousness, the serpent lines may not have carried electricity, but something more primal, resonance, memory, the breath of the earth herself. And now, they lie dormant, frozen in time, coiled in silence beneath the snow. Some researchers claim these formations were revealed only in recent satellite scans, where snow and cloud were digitally stripped to expose the raw terrain below. But almost as quickly as they appeared, the data vanished, archived, classified, deleted, because this is the pattern: discovery, suppression, silence. We do not live in an age of ignorance. We live in an age of curated forgetting. And those serpent lines, if truly artificial, truly sacred, pose a question no modern system dares answer. What if ancient man didn't worship nature? What if he conversed with it? What if these lines were not symbols of myth, but language? A serpentine script written across the crust of the world to align with the stars, to guide migrations, to encode geometry into geography, and perhaps to seal something in. Because serpents do not only lead, they guard, and sometimes what they guard is a door. So we must ask, were these lines carved to carry energy or to contain it? Was Antarctica once a sanctuary, or a prison, a power center, or a final vault hidden beneath the coldest cloak on Earth? We may never know, but the feeling remains that these coils beneath the ice are not done with us, that something once moved along them, light or thought or sound, and that something is still humming, faint and steady, beneath the deafening silence. We are not meant to hear it yet, but when we do, we will know it wasn't the serpent that was evil. It was what came after we cut off its path. And if the lines were not random, if they were placed, not formed, then who were they speaking to? And what have we forgotten that the ice still remembers? The forbidden sky visitors of Antarctica, they never came from above. They came through silence, through stars, through something the ancient ones never called a sky, but a veil, across every continent. In every myth, they descend, wearing light, wielding sound, disrupting the order of things, and always, always, they vanish where memory ends. In the south, the ancients knew the north as a compass, but the south was something else entirely. Not just a direction, but a gate. Antarctica, to the old ones, was not a barren waste. It was the bottom of the world's soul, the root, the place where light first entered and last escaped. The Dogon of Mali spoke of Namo beings who came from Sirius in ships that spun and hummed, but they did not arrive in the desert. Their memory leads south across salt, across storm, into the lands drowned in white. The Sumerians whispered of Anunnaki descending from the stars. The Vedas spoke of Vimani's flying, palaces of light. The Hopi remember Kushina. And in the Andes, the Viracaka gods sailed in from the edge of the world, glowing and terrible. And then there was Byrd, Admiral Richard E. Byrd, the decorated American explorer who led Operation Highjump in 1946, expedition larger than many wartime fleets. He flew into the white and returned haunted. Officially, he described hostile weather. Unofficially, he spoke of craft that moved from pole to pole. In moments, he spoke of vehicles that defied all logic, all propulsion, of a power not human, but present. and then he went silent. Documents classified, reports buried, witnesses reassigned, but in the vaults of declassified archives, fragments remain: telegrams, incident logs, radar anomalies over Queen Maud Land, objects tracked at impossible speeds, objects descending, disappearing beneath the ice, or the last zone of an ancient war still echoing. Because long before radar, before Admiral Byrd, before ink dried on any treaty, the sky over Antarctica was not silent. First Nations of Australia speak of the Wandjino beings of cloud and lightning, descending in robes of silence from a southern brightness. Maori elders speak of ships from Te Kori, the void beyond the world, bringing gifts of stone and language, then vanishing beneath the waves. Even in Amazonian myth, a white land beyond the storm is said to house beings who knew the stars like bloodlines. Why does it always point south? Why does no tradition ever say they came from the east, the west, or even directly above? Why is the southern sky the hidden door in every myth? And why now, when satellites orbit and secrets are fewered, we still know nothing of what lies above or below the pole? Some scientists speak of auroral currents, of geomagnetic distortions near the South Pole that interfere with instruments. But ancient memory speaks of something else entirely. A sky that opens, a sound that hums like language, a presence that does not fly but arrives, as if the atmosphere itself is thin there, as if the veil between realms wears away near Antarctica's heart. Satellite footage has shown brief, unexplainable pulses, beams of light rising from the ice, seen only in infrared, transient but rhythmic at Dome C. Researchers reported low-frequency sounds in the troposphere oscillations that do not match weather, wind, or seismic activity, but they do match something else, an ancient measure, a frequency long buried in stone temples across the world, a hum found in the King's Chamber of Giza in Tiwanaku, in Malta's hypogeum, 32 hertz, a breath, a pulse, a key. What if the sky beings never truly left? What if they were never visitors at all, but remnants or sentinels? Some traditions never speak of gods descending. They speak of watchers, and watchers do not interfere. They witness, they wait, they record. Is Antarctica their temple, their fortress, their wound? Because everywhere else on Earth, the skies became crowded, polluted, watched. But over Antarctica, there are no cities, no towers, no noise. And maybe that is why they still come. Even now pilots whisper, satellite technicians blink, aurora researchers glance at footage and say, that shouldn't be there, and yet it is. So we must ask, were the gods ever truly from above, or were they always from within, within the ice, within the earth, within the memory we were trained to forget? Because what we call extraterrestrial may not mean distant. It may mean hidden behind the veil of ice, behind the curtain of our own amnesia. And if the legends are not myths, but maps, then Antarctica is not the end of the world. It's the origin point, the wound that never froze completely shut, the gate that only opens when all others have closed. And maybe, just maybe, what we call visitors were always the ones waiting for us. They never came to conquer, they came to remind. And when we forgot, they waited, because the ice was never silence. It was memory, sealed in white. The stone that didn't belong. Some things aren't discovered. They are uncovered, and once seen, they cannot be unseen. In the white tomb of Antarctica, not everything is ice. Sometimes it's stone, and sometimes it shouldn't be. It was. 1984, a team of geologists with the U.S. Antarctic Research Program was cataloging mineral deposits near the Transantarctic Mountains. They were not looking for mysteries. They were collecting data mapping bedrock, glacial scouring, ordinary fragments of time. But then it appeared, not buried deep, not frozen in some unreachable crevasse, just lying there, alone. It wasn't large, no inscriptions, no dazzling symbols. But it was wrong. The rock didn't match anything in the surrounding geology. It wasn't native to the region or the continent. It was harder than granite, smoother than basalt, too symmetrical, too worked. One of the geologists later said, "It looked like a marker stone, not a fossil, not a boulder, something that had been placed. It had been shaped, striations across the surface, reflected polish abrasions that don't come from ice or time, but from hands, from intention." It looked artificial. Quietly, it was lifted, logged, tagged with a specimen number. The records confirmed this much, and then it vanished. Not just from the ice, from the archive, from the chain of custody, from the world. Attempts to trace the sample years later found no trail, no storage facility, no museum, no remaining photographs. Even internal memos related to the find were redacted, classified under special materials, buried deeper than the stone itself had been. Why? It wasn't radioactive. It wasn't dangerous, out of place, and in the machinery of modern science. Nothing is more feared than something that doesn't fit, because one anomalous stone calls every map into question. One unplaceable artifact breaks the illusion that we understand our world. And if one worked stone can be found in Antarctica, where nothing should be worked, what else might have been quietly removed? What else have we never been told? There are whispers, even among scientists, of other isolates, specimens logged, and then gone. Tools with no culture, shards of polished obsidian embedded in glacial till, a small statue, humanoid, faceless, and warm to the touch, allegedly recovered in 1993 and never seen again. Each story ends the same way: catalogued, contained, disappeared, and always in Antarctica, the one place on Earth that belongs to no one, where no nation may dig too deeply or claim too much. A continent wrapped in treaties, locked in silence. It is the perfect vault, not because nothing is there, but because something is. And when something surfaces, something that suggests hands, minds, civilizations far older than our own, it is not celebrated. It is sealed. The stone that didn't belong is no longer the only one. Satellite imaging has detected regular patterns in the terrain, rectangular shadows, linear ridges, angles too perfect for glacial drift. In 2003, beneath East Antarctica, ground-penetrating radar revealed a hexagonal structure 400 feet beneath the surface. Scientists called it a subsurface echo, then called it a glitch, but it matched no known natural formation, and it too was forgotten. Even climate scientists have stumbled upon anomalies. They were not meant to find pockets of warm stone deep beneath the ice, radiating heat with no volcanic explanation. Localized magnetic fields that distort instruments, regions that resist core sampling, as if something is repelling the drills. Some call them buried installations, others fossils of thought, structures not built with mortar and chisel, but with intention beyond comprehension. And if so, then the stone found in 1984 was not alone. It was a shard, a fallen fragment from a larger puzzle, a larger structure. A memory rising too early. Was it once part of a temple, a monument, a warning, or was it a key, something meant to be found when we were finally ready? But we weren't, and so it was taken, because every age has its guardians, not of treasure, but of silence. In the years since, the names have changed, NGOs, research alliances, military liaisons, but the outcome remains the same. Anything that threatens the narrative is hidden. Anything that threatens timeline is erased. Anything that dares suggest the past was more advanced than the present is buried beneath funding blackouts and bureaucratic fog. And so we forget the stone. We forget the hands that carved it. We forget the echo it left in the minds of those who touched it. But the ice remembers, and it does not forgive erasure, because stone does not lie, it endures, and eventually it rises like a splinter in the skin of time. And when the next stone is found, when it doesn't match the books, when it hums with an architecture not yet understood, will it be kept or taken? Will we be allowed to see, or will it join the others, lost not to glaciers or winds, but to silence? Perhaps Antarctica isn't the end of the world. Perhaps it's the edge of the known, and every edge has its centuries. The stone didn't erode, it didn't drift, it didn't belong. It was placed like a memory, waiting to be remembered. Mountains older than time, some truths lie not beneath the ground, but beneath memory. And some questions are so old, they no longer echo in our minds, only in stone, in silence, in ice. What if the world we walk upon is not what we think it is? What if, beneath the frozen heart of the South, a continent we've been told is empty, is anything but? There is a place so buried in white that even satellites hesitate. A place where mountains taller than the Alps rise unseen, hidden under more than a mile of solid ice. They are called the Gamburtsov Mountains, but their name is the least mysterious thing about them. Because by every law of geology, these mountains should not exist. There are no visible tectonic plates colliding beneath them, no rift zones, no subduction, no volcanic activity, and yet, like ghost bones beneath a shroud, they rise, sharp, angular, young in shape, but impossibly old in origin. Discovered in 1958 by a Soviet expedition during the International Geophysical Year, the Gamburtsov Range has remained one of Earth's most unreachable enigmas, stretching over 1,200 kilometers. Their peaks are as high as the Matterhorn, but not a single summit breaches the surface. They are the tallest mountains no human eye has ever seen, and perhaps they were never meant to be seen. Scientists tried to explain them. They said maybe they're the remnants of an ancient range, long eroded and later uplifted by unknown forces. But those forces remain unnamed, unexplained, and undetectable. So the deeper the scans go, the deeper the mystery gets. Radar penetrates the ice like memory returning in dreams. Brief glimpses of the impossible, angular ridges, symmetrical canyons, valleys too perfect to be random, like something shaped them with knowledge of form, gravity, and harmony. And that raises a forbidden thought. What if they were not made by Earth? What if the ice didn't just bury them, but protected them? A vault of time, a glacial tomb, a concealment, because some believe these are not mountains at all. They believe they are structures, ancient, sacred, and deliberately hidden before the last great flood. Long before Antarctica became a graveyard of snow, there are whispers that it was green, lush, alive, a land of rivers and twilight sun, of forest canopies and rain. And in that world, civilizations may have flourished, stoneworking cultures, sky-watching priesthoods, peoples whose knowledge rivaled gods, or was gifted by them. If so, they would not have built on the plains. They would have built where the energy lines crossed, where the veins of earth pulsed loudest. They would have built into the stone itself. Temples masked as mountains, sanctuaries shaped to endure the cleansing of oceans and the silence of millennia. And so, we return to the Gamburtsov Mountains, buried in a place we're not allowed to dig, not freely, not deeply. Why? In 2008, an international team of scientists launched a mission, a deep radar imaging of the mountain range beneath Dome, one of the coldest places on Earth. What they found rattled even the most grounded of them. The mountains were sharp, undisturbed, not weathered by time like other ancient ranges. It was as if they were preserved, frozen at their peak of perfection, which means they were frozen suddenly, violently, as if something catastrophic swept across the continent in one moment and locked it forever. A global deluge, a pole shift, a fall. There is a pattern here, a pattern of silence, wrapped in cold, hidden under treaties and ice, a pattern that repeats in every part of Earth where stone seems older than it should be. In Peru, mountains become temples. In Turkey, hills become chambers. In Antarctica, perhaps the mountain itself was the temple, or the boundary, or the beacon. In ancient myths, mountains were never just land. They were sacred. They were the axis of heaven and earth, the stairways where gods descended, or where men went to become. More than men. Olympus.meru.zion.kailash. Could Antarctica have had its own forgotten Olympus? A peak now buried beneath Dome, a not by accident, but design. What if this frozen range once marked the pole of an earlier world? Not the magnetic pole, not the geographic pole, but the civilizational pole, the spiritual apex of a planet before the tilt, before the fall. Some remote viewers claim the mountains are not just rock, they are hollow, chambered, occupied, a sleeping geometry, beneath the ice, waiting for the age of awakening. And that, perhaps, is why we are forbidden to go there, why every nation at war with each other above remains strangely united below, because something is still alive there, not in breath, but in memory, in frequency, in alignment. The Gamburtsov Mountains, if they are truly as old as the scans suggest, may predate the current cycle of human civilization, predate the known history of the continents, predate even the known shape of the Earth, because tectonics rewrite the crust like waves on sand. But these mountains, these impossible, symmetrical, buried giants, remain unmoved, unchanging, as if outside of time, as if waiting for something to return. The ice above them continues to thicken, to bury, but radar sees through it, and what it sees does not look like erosion. It looks like architecture, long corridors that stretch for miles, right angles where only chaos should dwell, echoes of sacred proportion, golden ratio alignments, not in sculpture, but incontinent. So who shaped it? Who walked those ridges when they touched open sky? And why did they seal them? There are legends in Smum, in Hopi memory, of a great war between skyborn beings, of ancient lands scorched by light and drowned in vengeance, of survivors fleeing, some into caves, some into mountains, and some into ice. Maybe the Gamburtsov Range is more than a monument. Maybe it is a vault, a library, a record left for the ones who would one day remember, the ones who, standing at the edge of forbidden snow, would dare to ask, why does this range exist at all? And why is it still warm beneath the ice? Because geothermal anomalies pulse below these peaks, mild heat signatures, like breath from lungs that do not exhale, like something old, still alive, still dreaming, still waiting for the seal to break and the world to remember what it buried. We speak of lost cities, we speak of drowned kingdoms, but what if we have never truly understood the scale of what was lost? What if entire mountain ranges were not natural at all, but monuments so vast, so sacred, that they could only be mistaken for the earth itself? What if the earth didn't build them, but received them? Some researchers have pointed to the unnatural magnetic patterns around the Gamburtsov Range, a quiet distortion, a whisper beneath the compass, as if something metallic or technological lies beneath. Metal that doesn't rust, stone that doesn't fracture, geometry that doesn't fade. They've called it anomaly, but the word doesn't explain the sensation. Those who've been near Dome A have described a stillness that is not peace, but presence, like standing near a great sleeping animal, vast and coiled beneath the crust, like being watched by something that remembers when the ice was not here, when the stars aligned in different skies. The silence of Antarctica is not just physical, it is political, spiritual. Coded. 50 nations have agreed not to mine, not to militarize, not to dig, not here, not now. Why? The mountain range beneath Dome A sits directly beneath the point most inaccessible on Earth, the furthest from all coasts. It is the perfect place to hide what must not be found, the perfect place to bury something meant never to be awakened in every ancient culture. The high places were places of memory. The gods carved laws in mountain stone. The prophets climbed peaks to hear the voice beyond the veil. What if the Gamburtsov Mountains once served the same purpose? Not only a spiritual axis, but a planetary command center, a resonance node of energy and intention. Some fringe historians suggest that the builders of these peaks, if they were built, were not of any known lineage, not Homo sapiens, not even Neanderthal, but something else, a predecessor race, or a parallel one. They speak of pre-ice civilizations who mastered harmonics, who shaped granite with sound, who encoded wisdom not in books, but in the terrain itself. And perhaps, sensing the coming fall, the flood, the tilt, the freeze, they withdrew. Into mountain, into memory, into ice, and they waited as we return. Thousands of years later, with sonar and satellite, radar and core drills, the question grows louder. Are we rediscovering the past or awakening it? The Gamburtsov Mountains, cloaked in eternal night, may yet hold secrets we are not ready to face, because to uncover them is to rewrite everything. Time, origin, hierarchy, God, and so they remain frozen. Unvisity, undisturbed, a crown of peaks for an empire erased, Or perhaps not erased at all, just sealed, until the world remembers, until someone listens again to the silence and realizes that beneath the deepest ice on Earth, the oldest truth is still waiting. The ancient dark spot. There are places where the Earth does not speak, where light refuses to reflect, where the magnetic breath of the world grows still, and something ancient, older than fear, waits in the quiet. In 2007, a NASA satellite passed over East Antarctica. A routine sweep, a simple scan, and yet something blinked back from the void. Beneath the ice, beneath the crust, beneath the veil, a circular region appeared, darker than its surroundings, colder than theory allowed, not just empty, not just hollow, but silent, in a way that defied explanation. Roughly 243 kilometers wide. It was as if someone had scooped a piece of Earth from the map and left behind only a question. They called it a gravitational anomaly, but no known tectonics could explain it. No impact debris, no shock ring, no sedimentary collapse, only the dark, and, like all true anomalies, it was quietly forgotten, or rather buried. But memory has a way of stirring when silence grows too loud. Some geologists speculated that it was the remnants of a prehistoric meteor, one so old and deep that even the stone forgot it. Others whispered of lava tubes and crystalline caves, vast subterranean tunnels melted by forces unknown, or deliberately carved long before the ice arrived. But beneath those hypotheses lies another theory, one more ancient, more disquieting, that this void is not a crater, not a cave, but an entrance, a sealed chamber beneath the pole, architectural in symmetry, magnetic in nature, planetary in purpose, a gate. And if so, a gate to what? In the mythos of the Vedas, the entrances to Patala, the underworld realms, were said to be guarded by coils of force and illusion, hidden in the remote poles, cut off from mortal sight. Tibetan scrolls speak of a great hollow beneath the earth entered through sacred passages in the north and south, where beings of light once dwelled beneath crystalline domes. And even the Hopi tell of antediluvian beings, the ant people, who retreated into caverns during a global firestorm, promising one day to return. What if the dark spot is not geological at all, but mythic? What if the Earth remembers an architecture before us, one that used no metal, no brick, no mortar, but force, frequency, technology of resonance, pressure, and polar geometry? And what if, deep beneath the Antarctic crust, the remnants of this architecture still sleep, sealed, buried, protected by agreements no government can name, and no satellite may fully penetrate? You see, the satellite scan that first revealed the dark spot came from NASA's GRACE mission, a gravity mapping operation designed to measure mass fluctuation across the globe. It detected subtle shifts everywhere, melting ice caps, rising oceans, even aquifer changes beneath deserts. But nowhere on Earth did it find something like this, a place where gravity bent differently, where the math faltered, where the laws no longer held. A circle within the continent, perfectly placed, deliberately hidden. Some believe this was why Antarctica was sealed, not merely for ice, not for science, not for peace, but to prevent entry, to keep what lies beneath from being disturbed. Because if it is a gate, then something once walked through it, and may again. Perhaps it is no accident that the dark spot lies not far from Wilkes Land, home to another circular anomaly, one theorized to be the remnant of an impact from 250 million years ago, the very event that may have ended the Permian Age. But what if it wasn't an impact? What if the darkening wasn't from collision, but from emergence? What if something rose instead of fell? Something that brought the long night, the frost, the silence. Some fringe researchers claim that the dark zone aligns in impossible ways with global ley lines, that it sits at a harmonic node, a junction of invisible energy once known to the ancients. Like the navel of a sleeping god, or the pupil of a blind eye that still sees. They argue it is not random, not accidental. It is chosen, like all the great pyramids, like Göbekli Tepe, like the ziggurats that rise where stars once fell. And so, if the dark spot is a doorway, the question becomes, who shut it and why? Perhaps it was not shut in fear, but in mourning. Perhaps something beautiful once lived beneath the pole, a city of sound, a temple of ice and fire, designed not for control, but for memory. Maybe the ice was not its tomb, but its chrysalis, the structure until the world was again ready to understand. Or maybe it was sealed as a warning, because some knowledge is not meant for hands of clay and bone, because some gates should not be opened twice. And now, as our technology pierces deeper radar, satellite, neutrino scans, we inch closer to the truth. And yet, strangely, none are allowed to dig there. No drills, no samples, just snow and silence. This isn't negligence, it's protection from what? We are not told. But in a world where information is currency, silence is a clue, and gravity, the one force we still do not fully understand, is the language of that clue. A whisper through stone, a song through the ice, a pressure that doesn't just pull us down, but calls us home, somewhere beneath. Layers of forgotten time, beneath the noise of our modern mythologies, the dark spot waits, not as absence, but as memory, not as whole, but as threshold. And perhaps, as we stare into it, it stares back, not with malice, but with mourning, because, whatever it once held, it remembers what it was like to be seen, to be opened, to be touched by minds that still understood. The sky. Maybe one day it will open again, or maybe it never truly closed. Maybe it's always been waiting for us to remember how to listen. Seashells on the mountain zit should not be there. A spiral shell, perfectly preserved, embedded in stone, frozen in the summit rock of a place no ocean should ever reach, perched atop the Transantarctic mountains, peaks that have slumbered beneath ice for what science claims is 30 million years. A fossil seashell broke the silence, delicate, curved, etched by waves that haven't touched this place in ages. But the shell didn't belong to the ancient oceans of pre-seasters, or why not, according to its fingerprint, not according to its depth. Carbon analysis, contested, ignored, whispered something else, that this seashell may have seen the sun only a few thousand years ago, not in the age of dinosaurs, but in the age of memory, in the age of us. And suddenly, the silence above Antarctica began to crack, because if there were seashells on the mountains, then the sea was here once. And recently, textbooks say the continent has been locked in ice for tens of millions of years, that it was once green, Yes, back when continents danced across the globe in slow tectonic waltzes. But the fossil in question wasn't that old, nor was it buried at a depth to match such timelines. It wasn't alone. Fossilized sand dollars, coral fragments, and marine microfauna, all recovered in scattered regions of Antarctica, particularly around the transantarctic range. These were not remnants of a tropical age lost to eons. They were hints of a flood, a rush, a sudden rewriting of the world. But what could have done this? What force could lift the ocean to the sky, or plunge the sky into the sea? There is an old theory whispered by ancient cultures, mocked by modern ones, the sudden pole shift, according to Hopi Incan and Egyptian records, written not in textbooks, but in myth. The earth has not always spun the way it does now. They speak of former suns, ages of fire, of ice, of water, worlds flipped on their axis in great cycles of destruction and rebirth. In Vedic astronomy, the tilt of Earth is not fixed. It wobbles, dances, and occasionally it falls. What if the poles have moved, not over millions of years, but in cataclysmic jolts, sudden, violent, unforgettable? Charles Hapgood, a name long erased from serious science, proposed this very idea, that the Earth's crust can shift in totality, gliding over the inner mantle like loose skin around a turning core, a movement of continents in weeks, not eons. And if that theory is true, Antarctica may not have always been where it is now. It may have been the edge of a temperate world, an island of memory, a citadel of warmth that was cast into the abyss of ice, not by time, but by tilt, a single turn, a cosmic breath, a planet flung sideways. The flood myths of nearly every culture begin to stir, because where there are mountains with seashells, there was once ocean, and where there was once ocean, there may have been life. Even civilization. Could a society have flourished there in the warmth of what we now call the bottom of the earth? The fossils do not say yes, but they do not say no. They only ask questions, silent, spiral-shaped questions no longer welcome in modern textbooks. The ancients may hold more answers than we think. The Egyptians called the southern land Tanator, the land of the gods. The Mayans described star beings that came from the south in canoes of light. The Maori of New Zealand spoke of a white land, cold, pure, and holy, that vanished beneath a rising tide. Over and over, stories repeat of lands swallowed, of memory erased, of mountains that once touched the sky, but now lie broken under water or ice. And now we find their remnants, not in temples, but in strata, not in scrolls, but in fossils, shells on summits, sand on cliffs, marine silt far above any ocean's roar. Each discovery a fracture in the story we've been told, each one a whisper. It didn't happen slowly. It wasn't what you think. The earth turned and the world drowned. The transantarctic mountains are not just frozen peaks. They are monuments of violence, twisted ridgelines that rise over 4,500 meters, cleaved by glaciers, but shaped, perhaps, by waves. What if they were once coasts? What if their fossil-studded peaks once kissed warm air, framed against tropical skies? And what if someone lived there? Not primitive, not lost, but aware. A people who watched the stars, who listened to the earth's hum, who knew the clock of the cosmos better than we do. They may have watched the sky shift. They may have prepared. They may have built structures beneath sealed scrolls. left markers, not in language, but in stone. And then the tilt came. The waters rose, and what had been paradise became prison, a prison of ice today. The fossils lie undisturbed, studied but not believed, documented but dismissed, because if a single seashell is believed to be younger than it should be, the entire story of Earth must be rewritten, and that, we are told, must not happen. It is easier to call it contamination, to blame glacial transport, to file the anomaly away with all the others, but the spiral shape still speaks, not loudly, not in certainty, but in rhythm. It mirrors the galaxies, the weather, patterns, the coils of DNA. It reminds us that history does not move in lines, it spirals. We are taught to believe that mountains are old, that they have always been as they are cold, distant, ancient, but the seashells say otherwise. They tell of warmth, of water, of movement, not across time, but across the map. Maybe we have not always been where we are. Maybe the sky above us was not always the same sky, and maybe the world changed, not gradually, but instantly, with a scream of gravity, a tilt of light, a wave that carried away not just cities, but memory itself. We still climb the mountains, we still walk on the ice, but we no longer see what's buried beneath, or listen to what lies above. The seashells are still. They're waiting, not to be worshipped, not to be decoded, but simply to be remembered. Because if we forget what warmth once lived in the south, we may never understand why the cold came at all. And if the earth can tilt once, it can tilt again. Atlantean echoes in the south, there are places the world has not lost, only forgotten, not erased, just buried beneath colder names. And sometimes, when the snow settles wrong, or a satellite glances where it shouldn't, old echoes break through, not with a scream, but a shape that shouldn't be there, a memory that doesn't belong. Unless you remember Atlantis. They said it sank in a single day, but what if it didn't drown? What if it froze? Across every ancient memory, from Plato's riddle to maps that bled into legend, there is one tale that continues to haunt our subconscious, an island of godlike engineers, radiant temples, and power beyond comprehension. Atlantis, the city of first light and final fall. Plato called it a land beyond the pillars of Hercules, a naval empire that once ruled the known world, destroyed not by man, but by the gods. He gave us measurements, distances, directions, and then silence. Centuries of scholars dismissed it as allegory, a cautionary myth, a metaphor, they said, for hubris. But what if it was a misdirection? What if beyond the pillars was not west, but south? Look beneath the ice, the shape of the Antarctic landmass, stripped of snow and time, bears an uncanny symmetry to the circular rings Plato described. 3 concentric circles of land and sea, an inner island, a sacred core. Radar scans and submarine topography hint at something strange beneath Queen Maud Land. Ridges that curl like ancient walls, channels that spiral like forgotten ports. Geologists say they are natural, but so did they when the walls of Troy were only rumor. Now, consider this. Antarctica was not always a frozen tomb. Once it bloomed. Once it flowed with rivers and forests and warm breezes, just as Plato described Atlantis. In 2017, scientists drilling through the ice found pollen, not from moss or algae, but from flowering plants, warm climate ferns, palms, seashells embedded in mountain stone. These aren't echoes from 100 million years ago. They whisper of a warming far more recent and sudden, a crustal displacement. A theory, long dismissed, proposes that the Earth's outer shell once shifted catastrophically, that entire continents moved. If true, it means that Antarctica may have once stood closer to the equator, a lush, habitable Eden. And then something shifted. Flood, freeze, silence. Could that be the moment Atlantis vanished? Mainstream history says no, but strange alignments say otherwise. Take the Piri Reis map, a fragment of cartography drawn in 1513 by a Turkish admiral. It shows Antarctica not as ice, but with visible coastlines and rivers. How satellite scans didn't confirm those shorelines until 1958. Yet someone drew them centuries earlier. The same map labels this southern land Terra Australis, home of ancient kings, an empire of the south. Some say these are coincidences, but the coincidences keep lining up, and the anomalies keep growing louder. Russian explorers in the early 1800s reported glimpses of rock-like structures protruding from the ice. British teams in the 20th century found oddly placed stones, cut, aligned, and polished in areas no volcanic or glacial movement could explain. Each artifact misplaced, each report quietly filed and then forgotten. Memory has its own gravity. It pulls at us. The Hopi spoke of a red land in the south where a god once rose and fell. The Mayans said the first city was swallowed by a freezing wave. In Vedic hymns, there is mention of Shweta, the White Island, where the gods convened and vanished. None of them call it Antarctica, but their metaphors all point the same way. There is a pattern beneath the silence, a rhythm buried in frost. Why do so many ancient flood myths involve not fire, but cold, not just deluge, but petrification? And why does modern science insist that nothing human ever walked Antarctica, when it also admits we haven't scratched even 5% of what lies beneath its ice? There are places too dangerous to remember. If Atlantis did not sink, but froze, then the entire premise of our timeline fractures. It means human civilization is not 6,000 years old. It means we've been here before, built before, fallen before. It means that history is not linear, but tidal, rising, crashing, erasing, and sometimes leaving just enough behind for those who remember how to listen. Maybe Atlantis wasn't the first city to fall. Maybe it was the last echo of a much older age, a southern beacon, holding on to something older than myth, longer than stone, a memory in white, too blinding to face. They tell us the South Pole is silent, that there is nothing there, but silence is not absence. Sometimes it's protection, sometimes it's warning. And when the ice melts, as it already begins to, what will rise from underneath? What symbols will awaken? What gods will we remember? What ruins will finally speak? If we are to believe nothing was ever there, then why was it? Once drawn on nearly every ancient map, before Antarctica was named, before it was even known, there was Terra Australis incognita, the unknown southern land, a continent presumed so vast, so rich, so essential, that cartographers across Europe, Arabia, and Asia placed it by instinct, not as guesswork, but as memory. Mercator, Orontius, Phineas, Ptolemy. They charted it, outlined it, sometimes even populated it with kings, beasts, cities of gold and fire. Their pens moved not by imagination, but by echoes. And when Antarctica was officially discovered in the 1800s, this entire continent of myth vanished from maps. Not absorbed, erased. Why? Was it too close to the truth, or too old to explain? Modern textbooks say Terra Australis was a mistake, a cartographic illusion caused by symmetry bias. That early mapmakers simply thought a southern continent had to exist to balance the north. But no one has ever applied such logic to the Arctic. No empires were imagined there, no cities, no gods. Only the South drew that reverence. Only the South was treated as sacred, and sacred lands, if real, are never allowed to remain open. If Atlantis truly lies beneath the Antarctic ice, then it is not just a ruin, it is a gate to a pre-flood world, to an age before the amnesia, to a version of Earth where we were not the peak, but the aftermath. It reframes everything. The megaliths scattered across the globe, in Peru, in Egypt, in Turkey, they begin to resemble fragments, not anomalies, signs of a lost unity, shattered and scattered by water, then frost. And perhaps it's no coincidence that the continent holding the greatest secret is the only one. Humanity has agreed unanimously not to touch the Antarctic Treaty. Over 50 nations, in the heat of the Cold War, agreed to leave it untouched. No drilling, no military, no ownership, not for a decade, but for generations, and no one ever asks why. What was really found? What couldn't be allowed to surface? In 1946, Admiral Byrd led Operation Highjump, a full-scale military expedition to Antarctica. He returned early, visibly shaken. He spoke of flying discs, craft that moved from pole to pole in seconds. His reports were redacted, his warnings ignored. But what if he saw something that wasn't flying? What if he saw something rising from beneath, from the rings of ice, from the walls of memory? Some researchers whisper of radar anomalies near the Gamburtsov Mountains, the same hidden peaks that shouldn't exist. They say something is under them, something circular, something hollow, but data is always inconclusive. Access always denied, and maybe that's the point. Atlantis was not meant to be found, not with eyes. It is a cipher, a mirrored truth, buried beneath thousands of feet of silence, waiting for our memory to align with the right question. Maybe it was not a city. Maybe it was a vault, a final inheritance locked away by the ones who came before, not for us to find, but to remember. A civilization that mastered the forces of stone, sound, and sky, who carved the ley lines, who balanced the earth. When the poles shifted, not just in geography, but in time, they let it fall, let it sleep, because we were not ready, because we had forgotten the language of stars. But ice cannot hold forever. Already, Antarctica melts. Already, satellite scans glimpse what the eyes cannot. Already, the maps begin to distort, and maybe, just maybe, that's why the myths are returning, why the world feels heavier, why memory aches in places we cannot name. Atlantis didn't vanish. It waits in a land beyond maps, beyond weather, beyond history, white, silent, watching, and the moment we remember it, it remembers us. Maybe it was never lost. Maybe it was buried, waiting for the right memory to return. The gods that went south, they came dressed in radiance, not with weapons, but with wisdom, not as conquerors, but as reminders. Their hands glowed with fire that did not burn. Their eyes saw through stone, and their voices carried the rhythm of the stars. In every ancient culture, there is a fracture, a moment when time splits and something enters the human story from outside, from beyond. Not always from above, but often from the south, the direction of mystery, the unknown, the forbidden. Long before modern compasses were etched in iron, ancient peoples mapped the world in memory. And south, across oceans and deserts, across myths and dreams, lay a place they called the Land of the Shining Ones, the place of origin, or exile. It begins in Sumer with the Apkallu, 7 sages who rose from the Abzu, the primeval deep, beings who taught language, law, measurement, and ritual, half human, half other. They did not come from heaven. They emerged from the waters, south of Eridu, south of memory, in Babylon. The tale sharpens into the figure of Oannes, the fish-garbed teacher who came by sea and refused food, speaking every tongue. By night, he returned to the waves. By day, he built civilization. He did not claim to be a god. He was a keeper, a witness. Across the ocean, Virakaka walked the Andes, pale, bearded, robed in light. He emerged after the flood, not to rule, but to restore. He carried a staff. He wept when he saw what humanity had become. He taught, he healed, and when his task was complete, he walked west into the Pacific, southward, toward the great white silence. Quetzalcoatl mirrored the same myth, a god of wind and knowledge who arrived from the east in a time of darkness. He brought order. He abolished sacrifice. He built cities aligned with the stars. But when the time came, he too departed on a serpent raft of light toward the morning star. But some versions say he went south, disappeared into ice, in the lands of the Dogon, a tribe in Mali whose astronomical knowledge defies explanation. Stories speak of Namo, an amphibious teacher who descended in a vessel that churned the earth and sky like fire. He too brought law, harmony, language. He too came from the south, a star mirrored beneath the earth. All across the world, the myth is the same. The names change, the symbols vary, but the pattern remains. After the flood, after the fire, they came from the south, and when their work was done, they returned, not to the heavens, not to myth, to a place hidden in time, a land too radiant to name, a continent forbidden, Antarctica. The trail is faint, but not lost in Polynesian lore. There is talk of Hawaii, a land of origin, across the frozen southern sea. In Vedic cosmology, Buloka lies just above the netherworlds, a vast ring of earth obscured by ice and time. And in the Book of Enoch, the Watchers descend not from the stars, but from a sacred mountain that rose before the flood, a mountain that some now suspect stood not in the Middle East, but far, far to the south. In each case, the south is not a direction, it is a veil between memory and myth, between what was and what remains. So who were these shining ones? Were they gods, or were they something else? Survivors, custodians, refugees of a broken world, carrying forward what little light remained after cataclysm drowned their home. Perhaps they were the last of a pre-flood order, a civilization so advanced their wisdom appeared divine, not because they were gods, but because we had forgotten what humans could be. And so they descended from their sanctuaries in the white south, not to rule, but to replant. They sowed seeds of stone, sound, and sky alignment. They whispered numbers into architecture. They encoded truths into temples, glyphs, and stories. And then, like a breath into cold air, they were gone, vanished into the realm where frost swallows memory, into the place where ice does not just freeze water, but history. Why did they leave? Maybe they saw what was coming. Maybe their time had passed. Or maybe their mission was never to stay, but to prepare us for return. If this is true, then Antarctica is not merely a continent. It is an ark, a library beneath the frost, a cradle buried in time, and those we once called gods, Virakaka, Oannes, Quetzalcoatl, the Namo, they were not divine. They were echoes, echoes of something far older, far colder, and far closer. They were the last emissaries of a world we cannot yet remember, because we have not yet become what they hoped we'd be. But the ice is melting, the sky is changing, and the myths are waking. What happens when the gate reopens? What happens when the gods come home? And if they really did vanish into the ice, what will rise when it finally breaks? The things that shouldn't be found. Some things are not lost. They are hidden, not by accident, but design. Not by nature, but by decision. And not because we are not ready, but because we were never meant to remember beneath the frozen skin of Antarctica. Far below the reach of sunlight or storm lie things not meant to be seen. Objects pulled from a past too vast for textbooks, too ancient for carbon, too intelligent for us to explain. They call them anomalies, classified findings, catalogued, sealed, and vanished. But sometimes they slip through, not the artifacts themselves, but the whispers, the second-hand testimonies, the obscure journal entries, scrubbed from publication, the intercepted radio signals from research bases, cut mid-transmission. We are told the continent is a desert, that it holds nothing but ice and rock. But every year, quietly and without headlines, objects are retrieved, objects that do not match any known age or culture, not Paleolithic, not glacial, not modern. Fragments of metal, surgically shaped. In a place with no recorded metallurgy, cylindrical rods embedded deep in non-volcanic strata. Unidentifiable isotopes with radioactive signatures that don't align with anything on Earth. Strange alloys, non-biological matter, micro-machined components, things that shouldn't exist, and yet they do. In 1995, a multinational expedition near the Princess Elizabeth Station reported a radar shadow beneath 1.6 kilometers of ice. Initial scans returned symmetrical, geometric echoes, hollow voids in repeating patterns. Days later, the radar array was shut down for calibration error. The team was recalled. No further reports were issued. In 2001, at a remote outpost near Dome Sea, a geologist was evacuated for psychological distress. He claimed to have witnessed an object being removed, described it as metallic, engraved, and radiating heat, despite the surrounding temperature being minus 50 degrees Celsius. His account was never officially published, but his name was quietly removed from the research paper he'd co-authored. Just weeks prior, these stories accumulate like frost on an old window, thin, brittle, easily dismissed. But together, they obscure the view. What are these objects? Natural formations, ice quirks, misidentifications, or are they the remnants of something buried, something built, something not of us or not of this age? Because the further we drill, the more we find. Not fossils, not relics, not artifacts, pieces that suggest design, function, intention, and yet they disappear. Crates flown out under diplomatic seal, research facilities locked behind military-grade authorization, discoveries reevaluated under new names, and then never mentioned again. This is not a new pattern. It mirrors what happened in Iraq when Sumerian tablets were confiscated under military watch. It mirrors what happened in Egypt when anomalous finds near the Sphinx were sealed. It mirrors what happens every time the old world threatens the new story. Suppression is not denial, it is control. And Antarctica is the most controlled place on Earth. No digging without permission, no satellites over sensitive zones, no public documentation of retrieved material, just a silence, cold, absolute, and enforced. But despite this silence, some truths still leak. A photograph taken by a Norwegian surveyor in 2003, never officially published, showed a polished slab of black stone, flat, reflective, partially exposed from melting ice. It was gone within 48 hours. The official report listed it as basalt, yet no nearby formations matched the sample. In 2016, a group of contractors working on a remote logistics station reported a sealed hatch protruding from the ice like a tooth. It hummed when touched. Security arrived. The hatch was extracted. The contractors were flown home, their NDAs upgraded to permanent clearance. What are we being shielded from? A truth too destabilizing, a history that rewrites everything, or a memory that proves we are not alone. Because buried beneath Antarctica is more than ice. There are things older than the continent itself, and the deeper we dig, the more familiar they feel. Some believe these objects are the remnants of a pre-glacial civilization, one whose technology mirrored ours in form, but not in origin. Not wires, not circuits, but resonance, frequency, biosynthetic alloys that respond to thought, stone etched not by tool, but by vibration. Others suspect something stranger, that these are not from Earth at all, that the continent, long before it was icebound, was a landing ground, a vault, a terminal, a place where knowledge or beings were stored for a cycle. Yet to come, it would explain the treaties, the no-fly zones, the quiet obsession of intelligence agencies with an empty continent. It would explain the ancient maps, the anomalous heat signatures, the pyramid-shaped peaks, the radar blackouts, the magnetic anomalies. And it would explain the silence, because to admit the truth would break the world's spell. It would undo the neat story we've been told, that history is linear, that civilization began in the Fertile Crescent, that we are the pinnacle. But what if we are the children of amnesia? What if these objects are not the first of their kind, but the last? Artifacts from an age that fell before ice, before flood, before language. They would not look like us. They would not behave like us. They would feel wrong, too perfect, too advanced, too silent. And perhaps that is why they are hidden, because they do not confirm our greatness. They reveal our forgetting. Not all who suppress the truth do so out of fear. Some do it to preserve the illusion of control. But the ice is thawing, and with it, the past is rising. And when the things that shouldn't be found are found again. When they can no longer be denied or hidden, what happens to the spell? What happens to the story? What happens to us? Not all buried things are dead. Some are waiting to be remembered. The world before it froze. What if we've had it backwards all along? What if the great white silence of the South was not the edge of the map, but its center? Not the exile of history, but its cradle? We've been taught to see Antarctica as a void, as a place without memory, too cold, too dead. It is not forgotten. Perhaps it is the one place that remembers. Before the ice, there was no Antarctica. There was a landmass, warm, fertile, vibrant. Tectonic models hint it once sat farther north. Paleobotanical evidence shows lush forests, flowering plants, and flowing rivers. Fossils of amphibians, ferns, even marsupials. Not a wasteland, a womb. A place that once sang with the pulse of life. A place that breathed. The question is no longer, was Antarctica ever warm? Science now answers that with certainty. The question is, when, how recently, and what lived there when it was? Because the deeper we peer into the ice, the stranger the echoes become. Myths from the Polynesians speak of a sacred land to the far south, a place of origin and of return. The Ambori called it Te Pito o Te Henua, the navel of the world. Quechua tell of Viracaka, the god of light, who emerged from the southern sea, bearing knowledge, geometry, and law. In Mesopotamia, Oannes rose from the Abzu, the deep south, half fish, half man, to teach the first cities how to build, to write, to remember. Even Plato, in his cryptic geometry of Atlantis, described a land larger than Libya and Asia combined, beyond the known world that vanished in a single day and night. And where would such a land fit? Only one continent matches that description. Only one has been erased so completely that we forgot to even wonder: Antarctica. But maybe it wasn't just a continent. Maybe it was a chapter, a lost beginning, buried, not just in ice, but in memory. What if the gods were not divine, but displaced? What if they were the survivors of a southern flood, one that came not from rain, but from frost? A cataclysm of inversion, a sudden shift of the poles, or a slow migration of crust that turned paradise to prison in geological moments. In a world before maps, before calendars, before chronology, how would such a fall be remembered? Not in timelines, in myths, not in language, in symbol. A serpent coiled beneath the earth, a fire extinguished by sky, a people who vanished into the snow, leaving behind only light. They would be remembered as gods, but they were likely refugees, carriers of wisdom that had no home. From Antarctica, they scattered northward, carrying seeds of memory to the Andes, the Nile, the Indus, the Pacific. This is why the pyramids echo across continents. This is why flood myths rise from every shore. This is why the gods of different lands share the same face, the same message, the same vanishing. They did not rise independently. They were remnants, fragments of a single source, fractured by climate, buried by time, distorted by retelling. We weren't told the full story, because the story didn't survive in books. It survived in bloodlines, in symbols, in stones, and most of all, in the ice. Because while history forgot, the Earth did not. Antarctica's core samples do not just show temperature shifts. They reveal strange chemical markers, anomalous spikes in greenhouse gases, ash layers from volcanic eruption. That match no known source. Buried beneath kilometers of frost are forests, mountains, lakes, and possibly ruins. What kind of civilization could thrive in such a place? One not bound by oil or concrete, but by resonance. One whose technology wasn't mechanical, but harmonic. One that aligned with the stars, the grid lines of the earth, the deep pulse of magnetism. Maybe they didn't build machines. Maybe they built memory itself into stone, into myth, into the architecture of the planet. And maybe we are walking through the ashes of their dream. Maybe the real fall of man wasn't disobedience or pride, but forgetting. Forgetting what we were, forgetting what we knew, that the earth is not dead rock, that the sky is not empty, that time is not linear, that Antarctica was not always white. Imagine it, a city under the aurora, crowned in light, temples that hummed with magnetic energy. The freeze, not a slow glaciation, but a sudden turning, the tilt of the world, the rage of the sun, a veil pulled down over paradise. They fled, those who could. Some made it to South America, others to the archipelagos of the Pacific. Some, perhaps, stayed behind, preserved, entombed, waiting, and now, unexplained heat sources miles beneath the ice, the same symbols found in Egypt, Peru, and Sumer etched into what should be barren rock. But this is not confirmation. This is reminder that history is not a ladder, but a spiral, that memory is not held in books, but in bones, and that time is not marching forward, but circling back. Perhaps the deepest fear of those in power is not that the past will return, but that it never left. Because if we remember the world before it froze, we remember who we were, not consumers, not survivors, but descendants of something older, of something luminous, of something lost. And that memory, once awakened, cannot be put back to sleep. The maps will change, the stories will shift, and Antarctica will no longer be the end of the world. It will be its origin. And when the last veil melts, when the final chamber cracks, what waits beneath may not be ruins. It may be a message, one carved in silence, written in light, hidden in the most sacred vault the earth could offer, ice. What froze was not just a continent. It was a chapter of humanity we were never meant to forget. The ones who remember across every epoch. There are those who forget, and there are those who remember, not through books, not through facts, but through feeling, an ache in the soul, a pull toward the stars, a memory with no name. The ones who remember are not defined by bloodline or birthplace. They are marked by resonance, by the strange sensation that this world is not what it seems, that something is missing, something sacred, something stolen, and they have always walked among us, whisperers, wanderers, the ones drawn to deserts, to ruins, to forgotten temples carved into the stone of time. They seek not treasure, but memory, not power, but truth, because somewhere in the marrow of their bones, they know the past is not behind us, it is beneath us. The ice is not just frozen water, it is frozen time, and when it melts, when it thaws, just enough to let the first breath rise from the deep, something ancient will speak. For those with ears to hear, indigenous prophecies across continents echo the same quiet truth, that when the southern ice begins to crack, when the white veil is lifted, when the sky over Antarctica opens, then memory returns in the Hopi traditions. The fourth world ends when the Earth is out of balance, when the ice shifts, and the ancestors reawaken. In Vedic cosmology, the Satya Yuga returns, not by force, but remembrance, and in the shadow teachings of the Andes, it is said that Virakaka will rise once more, not from the sea, but from the ice, and with him the song of the first world. Who keeps that song now? The ones who remember, not because they were taught, but because they never forgot. They walk through museums and feel nothing, but they stand before a mountain and weep. They read the official timelines and feel the lie before they know the reason. They look at Antarctica, not as a wasteland, but as a riddle. They sense that this world has been edited, not erased completely, but redacted, like ink poured over the most important chapter. And they spend their lives trying to read between the lines. What kind of soul searches for Atlantis before it is cool? Who studies the stars like old friends? Who listens to the silence beneath the earth and hears music? The same kind who knows, somehow, that their origin story has been stolen, that their greatness has been buried, and that their future is tied to a past that no longer exists except in echoes. They do not want validation. They want reconnection. They are not conspiracy theorists. They are memory holders, and they are waking up. Some dream of Antarctica, a city beneath the ice, a temple beneath the mountain, a library of crystal that hums when touched. They see symbols that shouldn't make sense, and yet do. They feel homesick for a place they have never seen, and they know, without proof, without permission, that this world has turned its back on something profound. But what if that forgetting wasn't permanent? What if it was a test, a veil, a silence, a long night meant to provoke the flame within? Because the ones who remember are not just archaeologists of the past, they are architects of the future. Their memory is not passive, it is magnetic. It pulls them toward ruins, stories, fragments of forbidden history. They collect these pieces not to hold, but to reassemble like broken stone around an ancient fire dot, like syllables of a language spoken before Babel. They do not claim to know, they claim to feel, and that feeling is the start of everything. What if you are one of them? What if this entire journey through the frozen south, through pyramids and serpents, treaties and fossils, was not just knowledge, but recognition, a whisper you've heard before, in dreams, the moment between waking and sleep, in the places that stir your soul for no reason. The memory is not lost, it's dormant, and it does not belong to history. It belongs to us, because maybe, just maybe, we are not the descendants of the ones who forgot. We are the children of the ones who buried it, on purpose, with care, with the hope that someone, someday, would return and dig and listen and feel and remember. So when the last seal breaks, when the final chamber opens, when the ice finally melts, it will not be a revelation to those who remember. It will be a homecoming, not of fact, but of soul. Final lines. We are not just seekers. We are the memory returning.